Sure. My name is Tammy Brewer, and I know many of the people in this room, and I'm so excited to get to see you today. I've been missing my GCS family, but it's so great to see you. And I am the tech today, so you'll hear from me a little bit later about kind of how we're going to manage today and get that there. But I'm officially the clinical assistant professor and school library program coordinator in the LIS department at UNCG. So I'm excited to see you guys, and I guess I'm going to throw this on over to Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Tammy. My name is Kelly Egan, and I am part of the state library team on this project. And I'm just so thrilled that we're able to do this today and have you all here to join us. So I hope it's a wonderful day, and you'll be hearing from me again later. And I'm going to hand it over to Jen Hamp.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to see you today. My name is Jen Hamp, and I'm the head of content and information delivery at the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library, part of the State Library of North Carolina. And I'm the principal investigator for the grant project that originally conceived of and has brought these workshops to fruition. So we're really excited to have this workshop today, to work with all of you, and to see our two-year dream sort of come alive.
Great. I'm going to also take this minute to remind you to please fill out the workshop survey before you leave today. There'll be a little bit of time at the end to do so. So now I'm going to throw you back to Tammy, who's going to talk a little bit, give you a little bit of technical information this morning.
Wonderful. So in the chat box, we're going to share with you, and you should have seen this as well in the invite, but this is the kind of landing page for our training today. It has the agenda very first thing, and then you'll notice there's a little timestamp at the top of each kind of posting here. One thing we do need you to do is click the sign-in form. So when you get there, please go ahead and fill that component out. The first action actually also has your agenda. So if you'd like to click on that and kind of follow along, you're welcome to, but it's also the same thing that's in front of you on the screen. The nice thing about our landing page is it has all of the resources and links to the resources that will be shared today, as well as the presentations. You may either click on the image to get to that, or sometimes you'll see a little bit of pink writing. And in that pink writing, that is a link to either the presentation or the resources to support it. So we hope we have everything kind of combined in one place. At the very bottom, you'll notice our contact information, as well as some information about our speakers. And we would like to click on the technical support area just to kind of walk you through, if you're, I know in Guilford County, you're accustomed to Teams. So since we're in Zoom today, we wanted to just give you a few little logistical things to help you as we're moving through the day. First thing is, at the very top or bottom, depending on where it shows up on your screen, there'll be a little expandable menu, and you'll see some view options. In that area, if you want to do side-by-side mode, that will help you see the presentation and then the guest speakers who will be speaking. We're going to spotlight them throughout the day, and you'll see that on the right. If you like a different view, that's fine. We just want to make sure you understand we want you to see all pieces to get the best experience. Also, we ask you today to kind of keep your mic muted until we're doing the breakout sessions, or we ask you to contribute as the whole group. Francesca, you heard earlier, she is going to kind of be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. She'll be there to kind of put those forth in front of our speaker. Also, you're welcome to keep your video on, but don't feel like you have to. I understand how it works with bandwidth. So the second button there helps you with the bandwidth component. And then if you kind of want to see who's in the group, or if you want to do reactions, sometimes your presenter may ask for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or how are you feeling about what we're discussing? So we want to make sure that you're involved the whole day. Even though this is virtual, we want it to be very engaging. And we know how a long Zoom day can be. So we have breaks built in and we have some things to support that. But you may want to open that participants box to be able to do that. And then the chat is right here in the middle. The other thing we kind of want to lead you to are those reaction buttons. It actually looks a little different than this screen. You'll actually see it right here. And so that you can do that. I believe it's right here is the reaction button. We do look forward to working with you today and want to thank you as well for your Flipgrid introductions. Those are also located right here on our Flipgrid. So feel free to go in, not only meet us in a little more detail, but also learn a little bit about the colleagues that you're going to be in here with in Guilford County. So they're ELA teachers from across the county, all different schools, as well as social studies. And I'm a little, partial to my school library media coordinators, but we're so glad to have you here. And Kathleen, I'll let you take us to the next section.
Okay, before we go, I did want to quickly mention, I saw Ashton Fonville pop on, and I did want to make sure that I introduced her because she is a very important part of our team. Ashton, you want to say hello and talk a little bit about?
Hi, everybody. I work as a UNCG graduate assistant and for this team. I work primarily as a web designer for our website that will be live hopefully soon. But I also help out with anything that the team needs, and I'll be working behind the scenes today if anybody needs anything.
Thank you so much, Ashton. And also, we had another graduate student helping us out, Madeline Moore. I'm not sure, Madeline, are you here yet? I don't see her on the screen. So if she pops in a little bit later, we will give her that chance to introduce herself. Okay, well, I am very proud to introduce our first speaker, who will be speaking in session 1, Lifted Out of the Shadows, Black Women and Girls Contributions to Social Justice in North Carolina. And that is Dr. Valerie Johnson from Shaw University. Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson is Dean Arts, Sciences, and Humanities at Shaw University and founding co-director of the Center of Racial and Social Justice at Shaw. Previously, Dr. Johnson served as the Mott Distinguished Professor of Women's Studies and Director of Africana Women's Studies at Bennett College in Greensboro. Among her several board appointments, she serves as the chair of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. She's a member of the North Carolina Historical Commission, National Register Advisory Committee, Preservation North Carolina, and recently the North Carolina Maritime History Council. So we are so proud to have you today, Dr. Johnson. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really do appreciate this welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to talk with you and discuss with you a little bit about some of my research and how I have come to this idea of lifting out of the shadows Black women and girls' contributions to social justice in North Carolina primarily, though I'll touch on a couple of other things. Before I go any further, we always like to acknowledge the land that we are on, the indigenous communities that are part of this land. There are an assortment, and if you can think of where you are, there's probably an indigenous community that was originally inhabiting the area. For me, it's Meherrin, Tuscarora, Hallawasaponi, of course, Cherokee, Lumbee, Pembroke, and I acknowledge that presence, first of all. So first, I'd like for y'all to take a deep breath and be prepared to go on a really quick overview of a variety of women who I think, and girls who I think are important for us to know a little bit about. And I will also be guiding us through some ways in which you can infuse in your classrooms ideas about social justice and change without going too far astray from the standards that I know you have to adhere to in your various grade levels. So first, before I go even further, I'd like to thank Kelly Egan and her team for inviting me to share with you this I like to call it discussion. I'm hoping that you'll have good questions to ask me and that I'll be able to interact with you all in that way. And I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute and pull up the PowerPoint. Let's see. Wait a minute. Okay. I always do this. Okay. I need to get this in slideshow mode. Okay, that's much better. So again, the title of this talk is Lifted Out of the Shadows, Black Women and Girls, Contributions to Social Justice in North Carolina. And I will go over this particular mural in a little bit, but I like to use it as a backdrop and a centering of me here at Shaw University. One of the things that frames this discussion are ways in which we need to contextualize social change. One, not all social change is for the good of our society. There are ways in which society changes or there are movements that are not positive. And we have to recognize that this is often contested area, what is good for the greater society. And so I will be presenting a more positive view on social change from the perspective of Black women and girls, but it's not the only way we can look at social change. The other key point that I want to address is that we're working toward a society that values the existence of Black women and girls. And so I think that that's important for us to remember that the foundation of all the work that these women and girls are doing has to do toward also valuing their existence in society. And I will also demonstrate through this talk the different ways advocacy and civic engagement appear. So I come back to this first slide, and I do so because in it, you are a variety of narratives. If you look closely, not only do we have the founder of Shaw University, Henry Martin Tupper, we also have Ella Josephine Baker. And before I move to Ella Baker, I do want to say that Henry Martin Tupper could not have done his work in helping to found Shaw University without also his wife, who is Sarah Baker Leonard Tupper. And those names come to, we celebrate those names in different ways on our campus. So I like to think of Henry and Sarah as our founders. You will also notice that there is symbols of different professions, medical profession and the legal profession, both refer to early history in Shaw University. We had a medical school, Leonard Medical School, as well as a law school for a very short period of time. All of this was during the time of Reconstruction. And those institutions don't exist as schools, but they are a part of our DNA and appear in our Center for Racial and Social Justice, for example, and our Life Sciences Institute, which is another iteration of our medical training. You'll see here Chavis Park. And we come to my next big idea around how do we talk about various people's narratives. So I don't know if any of you were familiar with Willie OTK and her sisters. She is a very interesting person in the life of Raleigh and in the life of North Carolina. Not too long ago, there was a display of her dresses. She's known as a seamstress among many things. And this is Willie K in the center and surrounded by her sisters. There are five sisters who belong to this family. And she, there was an exhibit of her work made especially for you by Willie K. And it was an expansive interactive exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of History. It talked about not only Willie Kay as a seamstress, but her life as a Raleigh native. She graduated in the Shaw University class of 1912 and was known to sew dreams into dresses. Now, this exhibit ended in September pre-COVID, and it was the work that they displayed, her dresses, because they're so fragile, could only be displayed in a very limited fashion. And I'm going to come back to this idea of seamstresses and entrepreneurship. But one of the things to know about her story, when you go into a fairly deep dive into their family history, it was emblematic of many middle and upper middle class Black movement within North Carolina, but also how they contributed to their universities, the HBCUs, as well as their greater community. Now, Willie Kay, made debutante dresses, wedding dresses, party dresses across racial lines. So her clientele were both Black and white communities, primarily Black and white communities. She created Episcopal vestments. Her home church is St. Ambrose Episcopal. She's known for sewing the baptismal gown of Ralph Campbell Jr., who becomes a prominent person as North Carolina's first African-American state auditor. That was her grandson. I say this because if you start looking at the connection and the networking, you'll get an idea of how you can talk about many firsts, but also the participation of African Americans in civic life. And her family alone, I mean, I could spend the whole time just talking about Miss Willie Kay. Her family became prominent in the 60s and 70s, but what was interesting about her early life was not only did she finish from Shaw in 1912, but she married, her husband was a physician and went to Leonard Medical School when it was still in existence at Shaw University. And they moved to Wilmington. He was instrumental in creating one of the first community hospitals there in Wilmington, North Carolina. Unfortunately, she became a very young widow. He died at age 37. So she had to rear her children, and she had 5 on her own. She came back to Raleigh, and during that time was when she really took prominence as a seamstress. So if you look at the arc of her life, you can see her early years. It talks about African-American early education. There's a component of her connection to a Black church, the St. Ambrose Episcopal. There is her experience in Wilmington, North Carolina. They're also connected to Black builders in Wilmington. So there's a lot to unpack when you just take one woman's story. And that was what I'm getting at here to introduce you to Miss Willie Kay and her sisters. They always said Willie Kay and her sisters, because they also did work with her. They're very prominent in their own right. She also, and this is the other piece to a continuing thread, there's a thread of philanthropy that occurs also with the work that she's doing and with what the works of other Black women and girls. And one thing she did for her family was the proceeds from all of her work, her business, she sent all 6 of her children to Shaw University and gave back to her alma mater, which I very much appreciate. Now, this next photo is again of a Raleigh native. Her name is Dr. Anna Julia Hayward Cooper. She attended St. Augustine's normal school, and as we know it today, it is now St. Augustine University. And I always, this is one of the things to know about making sure you say things right. I've been used to saying Augustine's and Augustine's, and those are two different places. And so alums of St. Augustine are sure to correct you if you shorten it to St. Aug or you say the other place in Florida. Anna Julia Cooper, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, was known for her work in education. She spent about 40 years as an educator in Washington, D.C. So we get to see the movement of folks from one place to another, but her roots are here in Raleigh, not too far from where I'm sitting. One of the things she becomes noted for is her Black feminist text that she wrote and was published in 1892, A Voice of the South from a Black Woman of the South. She was the fourth Black American woman to earn her PhD. She earned her PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris at the age of 62. So I also like to highlight that education continues over a lifetime, that folks did not give up on their dreams. To be able to earn your PhD at 62 and still have a productive life is, to me, a good example. And so part of what can happen as you talk about the stories is to give examples of what's possible, what people were able to do with as little as they had. She's also the only woman who is, and the only Black person who is quoted in the passport, the US passport. So the last page of the US passport is this quote from Dr. Anna Julia Hayward Cooper. And it was a foundational idea of hers to always advance humankind, to be an advocate for social justice. And I like just to say, just to have, when I'm holding my passport, to know I'm holding wisdom from Dr. Anna Julia Hayward Cooper, Raleigh native, whose story, again, could take up the whole time. But I'm pointing out that this is one of our influential persons. The next one is another one that is known in Durham, and that is Polly Murray. And Polly Murray has a quote here that this mural is in Durham, not too far from the John Hope Franklin Humanities Center, and it's on a brick building that was part of an industrial complex right there on Broad Street in Durham. And what's interesting to me about the quote is that it reminds us that we have to accept the whole past, and we can get strength from all her roots. Her roots include an enslaved ancestors, being queer, being a part of a community that was marginalized, being part of a middle-class community, having fought against what she called Jane Crow as well as Jim Crow, that she was unable to enter into UNC Chapel Hill at the time that she wanted to because of her race. She finished law school at Howard University in the top of her class. She was actually the valedictorian. And as such, there was a guaranteed slot at Harvard University at Yale University, for anyone who finished in the top of their class from Howard, yet she was denied because of her gender. So she helps us talk about the intersection between race and gender and sexual identity. She also becomes the first African-American Episcopal woman to become an Episcopal priest. So again, using a singular story allows us to talk about race, sexuality, feminism, spirituality, religiosity, and of course, segregation. So we get all of this in looking at her story. We also get to come up to a contemporary point where this is in her family home that's in Durham, that is now a national landmark. There are few national landmarks that depict or are named for women in this country. And there was one right there in Durham, North Carolina. And these are panels that are part of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice that kind of give you her various activities in social justice, her religious, living by word and deed, her suffrage work. She lived from 1910 to 1985. So it's an important life. And this is another one who we kind of know a little bit more about, but it took quite a while for us to come to this point. Keep mindful of my time. The next person that I want is the third person and brings us to Guilford County. So we're from Raleigh and Wake County through Durham, Durham County, and now we are in Guilford County with the Palmer Memorial Institute and Charlotte Hawkins Brown. And this is it is the only, at present, it's the only state historic site that again interprets the life and work of a Black woman. And it's right there in Sedalia. So this allows for field trips when you're able to do so. And the grounds are pretty extensive so that there is a lot to talk about in the single woman's, again, narrative. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown is right here to the right. She's with her quartet. They promoted she was an extraordinary fundraiser. She founded Palmer Memorial Institute when she was 19 years old. And she founded this school because there was a need to educate those who had come out of enslavement. And she was passionate about promoting education. That wasn't all. So part of her thrust and ideas around education was empowerment of communities. So, excuse me, there was a time she took, as it says in the slide, a year off to travel and study. She's considered one of the 3 B's of education at the time. And I also use this kind of slide to illustrate, again, the mobility of people in the Black community, in this case, Black women, so that we don't need to just think of Black women staying in their one place. She traveled and she went to Europe. And in Europe, she met up with Mary McLeod Bethune and Nanny Helen Burroughs. These were the 3 B's of education. And their ideas are in this next bullet point where Dr. Brown believed in combining education, religion, and deeds. So there was an active component in the education that she provided at Palmer Memorial Institute. Mary McLeod Bethune talked about the head, the heart, and the hand. And she founded Bethune-Cookman University. And Burroughs was the book, the Bible, and the broom. And again, all of these were ideas around education for yourself, as well as education to improve your community. And this is, again, an area where you can have a discussion around the importance of education and that it had always been an important part of Black community. By the mid-1920s, Brown was a nationally known speaker. Not only did she talk about culture and liberal arts for racial uplift, prior to 1990, she was a staunch suffragette. And so she worked in North Carolina to help promote the rights of women to vote. She was also part of the Black Women's Club movement. So there's a lot to, again, unpack with just talking about Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I returned back to back to Shaw University to talk about a person who is a little less known, Dr. Louise Cecilia Lulu Fleming, who was in one of Shaw's early medical classes. She ended up leaving Leonard Medical School because she was in that first class and did not have enough access to the medical knowledge that she wanted, and ended up going to Philadelphia, where she got her degree in medicine in at the Women's Medical School, and was the first Black woman to graduate from that medical school. She ended up going to the Congo, at the time it's called the Congo, and sending young people back to Shaw University to be educated. And she did so through her religious affiliation with the American Baptists. And that is also a part of how we can talk about the life of a woman such as Dr. Louise Fleming. She did become ill, and her life was cut a little short because of the illnesses that she contracted when she was in Africa. Another way in which we can talk about and understand philanthropy in the Black community is through the Garden Club movement. And this picture is taken in the 1950s. It is in Oxford, North Carolina. This is the Nature Lovers Garden Club. And not only did these women come together, as you can see in their hats and their gloves, as very proper women, they raised money in order to combat segregation in this way. What they would do is help improve the infrastructure. Many of the garden clubs that were founded and populated by African Americans were designed to beautify their homes, yes, but also to improve their community by bringing in infrastructure. So some of them brought in sewage systems because there were no sewage systems in their town. It was because of segregation. Others used the monies to create parks for their community. And I said I would talk about Chavis Park. Chavis Park in Raleigh, North Carolina is named after John Chavis, who's the ancestor of one of the founders of the Nature Lovers Garden Club, Mrs. Elizabeth Ridley Chavis. And I'm looking here, I believe that yes, this is right here, Mrs. Chavis, whose offspring have also contributed to quite a bit. The oldest daughter, Helen, Dr. Helen Chavis Otho, was an educator at St. Augustine's and is still a prominent woman in her community and a remaining member of the Garden Club. Her youngest son is Benjamin Chavis, who people may know more about, who worked in civil rights and is still very active in social justice. And one of her other daughters is a physician in Oxford, North Carolina. They were all a part of this Black upper middle class who created the infrastructure that was needed for people to have a better quality of life. That family alone in their little community put in tennis courts, they contributed to the orphanage. And I say all this to again illustrate how you can look at people within your community and use them as examples of how to talk about matters of race and social justice and social change and social structure. as well as being able to put in their ideas around gardening, talking about the natural environment. There are a lot of ways that you can intersect stories by talking about, for example, this garden club. So part of what I'm hoping to do, and y'all can give me feedback, is to give you ideas about ways to infuse interdisciplinary ideas within your lesson plan. So I bring this to the use of literature. We who believe in freedom, that particular phrase is taken from a song by Sweet Honey in the Rock that they wrote to celebrate the life of Ella Baker. And Ella Josephine Baker, again, going back to Shaw University, was a graduate of Shaw University, primarily known as sort of the, she helped facilitate the birth of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, of which you've heard a lot about in connection to John Lewis. But SNCC was founded in 1960 at Shaw's campus, and primarily through the efforts of Ella Baker, who spent a lifetime advocating for human rights. This is a young artist, Gemini, at the African American Cultural Celebration in 2020. I had to pause there because 2020 is a split year, and we think of it as all COVID, but this was right before the shutdown occurred because this was in January. So I think I need to put in my side January 2020 for folks to realize we were still meeting and congregating. And that again is something to discuss and be able to highlight. So I showed Gemini, who presents here as a they, non-binary, queer young artist, African American, who works for LGBTQ rights in Durham, but also is this amazing self-taught artist and DJ. And so if you get really ambitious, which I did not do, I did not bring in some of her music that she has. I didn't bring her playlist, but you can infuse a playlist. Kind of deliberately so, because it's really not my music, and I don't want to misspeak about it. But it can be a point of discussion in the classroom. And you see her particular style, and I like to show you her rendition of Ella Baker. And what's important about this piece is that it brings Ella Baker to the 21st century, and it helps introduce her to younger people through the artistry of a young artist, and the importance of the visual art in helping interpret and understand our history. And this introduces We the People Protect Each Other, what I like to call the section on environmental justice, which is another way to discuss our history in North Carolina. So I'm going to go quickly through. These women are from Warren County and Franklin County. This particular person here is Dolly Burwell, who was instrumental in the environmental justice movement in 1982. She and her group were the ones who laid down in front of the trucks who were bringing toxic materials into Warren County. And that's considered one of the launching points of the environmental justice movement. They were going, in this picture, they're going to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and that was in 2013. Her daughter here, Kimberly Burwell, I like to raise up for two reasons. One, she was 9 years old when her mother was engaged in this action. And so this is the part of young people involved. And she is the one, Kimberly Burwell, who coined the phrase, environmental racism. Now, other adults have kind of taken over that idea of who coined the phrase. But when you go back to it, and from the people who were actually there, Kimberly turned to her mother at 9, looked at what they were engaged in and said, yes, mommy, what this is environmental racism. And that phrase gets put into the United Church of Christ's toxics report that then is disseminated across the country. And now we use the term environmental racism. And I could bring it right on home down to Warren, North Carolina, to this 9-year-old child who did make it into adulthood, but shortly after this photo was taken, not too many years afterwards, died from kidney disease. And so it also points out that this is the hard part of talking about struggle, and that you have to also not just present the very, very positive, but what has happened with people, where are they now? And I think that's important. Excuse me. This woman here, Rosa Nell Eaton of Franklin County, was the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit against the voter identification bill. And I say this is 2013. And we are still having this discussion now in 2021. When you see that she is one of the elders. Again, not folks. Now, I didn't put this in here to put me in here, but to point out the environmental justice movement also works with noted people like Dr. Steve Wade. Again, he's not with us. He died from cancer in 2016. However, his work helped provide the foundation for the various lawsuits against the hog industry, because he was the one, as a public health instructor, taking students to understand the health implications of these hog farms. No, he's not a Black woman, but this is to me a part of the intersection, because he helps inform this child, Kamari Kaylin, who is my daughter, I have to claim that, in the ways in which she has taken the messages of environmental justice and infused them in her young career right now. She just finished from Wellesley in 2020. This was when she was still in high school and attending these kind of conferences. So the connections are important. And it's important to give examples of how young people are involved in these movements. So I include the slide here, and this PowerPoint will be available to you all, so you can kind of go back and pull out what you need. But this is I think it's important to look at the mission of the environmental justice movement, because it was co-written by this woman, Naeem Muhammad, who is one of the organizing co-directors of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. So it's a network of grassroots communities engaged in environmental justice. And I also point out Cynthia Brown, who's from Durham, North Carolina, who was from Durham, North Carolina, and a graduate of Bennett College. So this brings it back to Gilbert County, as a political science major. And she's giving a workshop. She's leading a workshop on how to do movement work in an interracial way across a diversity of communities. Unfortunately, she too has died of cancer. And I say this deliberately because it is often very hard work continuing to be activists in the community, and it can take a toll on folks. These are a part of our future. They're all Bennett Fellows who finished by now. This is Arabia Patterson, who currently is just finished her master's in public health. And this Brotherly Jones also has finished, and this is her poster. She goes by Malik. A poster that she did of some research that she was able to do in and present at the summit. And then this is a young woman who finished in psychology, all from Bennett College. And some more earlier Bennett College students who are attending this conference. And I put this in here to show, this is the meeting at the Franklinton Center. This is where we all are, Franklinton Center at Bricks in Whitakers, North Carolina. That was in the 60s. And so it's kind of mirroring what happened in terms of the continuity of environmental justice. And I put this slide in because I find it important to also recognize the scholarship that has gone in documenting what Bennett Bells did in terms of activism. And she talks about passing the torch of liberation from one generation to next. And the she I'm referring to is Dr. Linda Beatrice Brown, who was a professor at Bennett College. And again, here we go with, you start with a one person's story. Her aunt was Willoughby Player, who was the first African-American woman to lead and be president of a 4-year institution in this country. So Dr. Linda Brown wrote about the ways in which Bennett College women were involved in the struggle in the 60s and that sit-in movement. And so it's a wonderful text. It's easy to read because she's interviewing her classmates and learning from them what happened and how it happened and how they felt about being part of the 60s movement or being part of this movement that occurred. And this again comes from work where Thurgood Marshall came to Greensboro. And so by referencing and talking about the women at Bennett, you can talk about someone like Thurgood Marshall. Why would he come to Greensboro? What was his role in trying to end segregation at the time? He wasn't on the Supreme Court, but he was a part of the NAACP. So it allows you to talk about legal matters and read in how do we come to the story, where journalism is an important aspect of getting the story out. And this is a Bennett Bell who's Ollie Johnson picketing downtown Greensboro. And this happened over time. It wasn't just 1960 and done, but they were picketing for several years. But even earlier than that is, and this is a record from the Crisis, is an article. They talked about why the logic of women's suffrage. Why should women get the right to vote? Why are we advocating for this? And they brought together a symposium of all kinds of thinkers in the colored community to talk about this. And this was in 1915. And it's an article that goes on and on. But this is what Nanny Helen Burroughs looked like as one of the contributors to this symposium. And they have quotes from various women talking about the importance of the right to vote. And I raise this because here's evidence of suffrage movement by Black women prior to 1919, that they were always advocating for the right to vote until it happened. And then we know what happened afterwards. So you can also take that forward. In honor of my librarians in the room, I had to put in a photo of Molly Houston Lee, who founded the Richard B. Harrison Library here in Raleigh, but she also founded the North Carolina Negro Library Association. She maintained a collection chronicling the African American experience, both locally and nationally. That collection was over 5,000 volumes, and it was adult and juvenile fiction, nonfiction, serials, pamphlets. She did a vertical file, all of this as a part of the Richard B. Harrison Library. She's, again, this instrumental figure. She was born in 1907. She died in 1982. She was that first African-American librarian in Raleigh. She also was a librarian at Shaw University. So again, you know, I'm making these connections, bringing it back home, where from where you are, what is the history? What are the connections? How does this connect to the communities that you're talking about? She attended Howard University, and that was when she became interested in being a librarian. And so I like to highlight her. She had a 37-year career at Harrison Library. The library started as a tiny one-room storefront library on Hargett Street to a 300, at the time of this article, a $300,000 structure on New Bern Avenue. She retired in 1972 to have fun and do some of the things she hadn't had time for. She was an enormous influence in terms of library science and also just understanding, documenting African American experience, especially in Raleigh and Wake County. She, among the other things, she was the second African American elected at large to the American Library Association. She represented the ALA at the White House Conference on Aging. In 1971, she was the first African American woman elected to Tar Heel of the Week as a result of her various contributions. So can't have a discussion about important Black women and their contributions without including Miss Lee. And as I wind down, so to give time for at least a little bit of questions, I'm going to go over some of these ways of which, in a more contemporary sense, activism and social justice work shows up. So you see the pins, I am Black and I vote, and rooted in community, North Carolina. This was the March on Washington, March for Black Women that occurred in 2017, and a group of us from the Raleigh area, from the Research Triangle area, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, went to DC for this event, actually included folks from other folks from North Carolina. And in looking at activism, one of the things I would point to is the ways in which it's intersectional. So one of the issues that this young woman was pointing out is colorism, and talking about how colorism is also a barrier and oppressive thing that needs to be addressed. So her understanding of, for example, White supremacy is as a mixed race person, and what does that mean, and how does that affect her? These are the women, some of the women whose names we don't know and who disappeared. The other way that activism shows up is in the life of someone like Monica Roberts. Monica Roberts was the founding editor of Trans Griot, which was an online blog advocating for transgender people, especially because of the violence of their lives, that many of them were disappeared. And so this is another way of looking at social media, which young people have access to see what are people writing about, how are folks showing up. Unfortunately, and I know I keep pointing out to people who are no longer with us, but this is reality of understanding lives. She died a year and a half ago, pre-COVID. It wasn't related to COVID. maybe from a pulmonary embolism. They're not quite sure what happened to her. And the tragedy of that was that she was always writing about how transgender people were being killed, and no one was making note of it. And I end this talk with a reference to how the visual arts, again, are an important documentation of our history. This particular quilt was, and I'll show you the person who created it, who's from Durham, and it's hard to tell, but this is the American flag. And it's all in these muted black and gray tones. And these are the stripes here. And the big bowl, a man was lynched yesterday, documenting the history of lynching, especially in the Southern context. So how do you have conversation? What is the entry point into having a discussion about this? And this is one fabric artist's way of drawing attention to something that needs to be discussed. And this is the artist, Saluda Azar, who's from Durham, part of 2 different quilt circles, where these women have gotten together, and in their quilting are storytelling. They're telling stories both out loud, orally, but also through their fabric work. And so that is another avenue of talking intersectionally and interdisciplinarily about history, about actions that have occurred in our past. And I end with this photo from 2014 at the end of the beginning, of the historic march. It's HK, Historic Thousands on Jones Street, HK on J, that was founded by Reverend Barber and a team of people. These are some of my colleagues from they weren't my colleagues then, but women from Shaw University. And this is Shaw in the background, the chapel, our bell tower. And this is what they are reminding us of. We won't go back, and talking about back to ways in which we're oppressed. And so for me, this is an uplifting slide. And then I have the references, the different resources and additional resources that undergird this, and my thank yous. This research, pulling together the different aspects of this, comes from a residency program through UNC of Maryland, work with the National Endowment for Humanities, a fellowship I received, as well as what's listed here. And I thank you for y'all's attention. And I'm going to stop sharing at this time and see what's going on.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We really appreciate your presentation. I learned a lot. I was trying to follow along with your presentation and putting links about who you were talking about throughout it. We had a question in chat that I think is something that a lot of people would like to know is, how do you teach these topics without mentioning critical race theory, or in this topic, gender discrimination?
So I have to step out of my academic freedom university kind of stance, because that is a very difficult one for me to say. Now, as you can see, I didn't say the word critical race theory, but if you hear me talk about intersectionality, that's critical race. That comes out of critical race theory. I think that you can reference you start with the way that I started with. Here's a person's story. what is their story? How do we understand this particular person's story? Well, when I talk about Pauli Murray, I cannot not talk about the fact that because she was a woman, she was denied entry into law school at Yale. I always get it mixed up, Yale and Harvard. But no, it was Harvard because she ended up going to Yale. Excuse me, I misspoke. She experienced, if you talk about the experience of women's lives, the other thing I didn't mention was she was one of the founding members of the National Organization for Women. You can talk about, well, why would she do that without saying the words gender discrimination? But we can't hide from the truth of where we are in our society right now. But you can finesse it, I guess is the best way to say. Because for me, I'm pretty straightforward. It is what it is. I don't know if that, I'm thinking about how young folk are, they're thirsty. They want to know, they're thirsty and hungry for knowledge. So presenting them with a range of viewpoints can be a helpful way to talk about a subject. Here's how different people approach the idea of who should and should not be in certain places. But I think that we cannot, it's a disservice to our young people, and maybe this is the political me, but I can remember the time I was turned off from history. So the irony that I am on historical mission does not escape me, was 8th grade, Mr. Whitlock, who, and I, as old as I am now, I can remember that moment when he refused to acknowledge that there were problems with only talking about the westward expansion in terms of cowboys and Indians in that old style. And I'm sitting there as one of the only Black people in this classroom saying, well, what about, and knowing that there were other stories, there was other parts, and being shut down, being told that we weren't going to talk about that at all. We were going to talk about Black folks in the West, even though I'm sitting here as a Black person in the West. And that turn-on, that anger that I had, fueled me to go and do my own research. But I had the resources and I had the background to be able to do so because both of my parents are college educated and went to historically Black colleges, Spelman and Morehouse, and told me about those. So I had the wherewithal to go and find in 8th grade the stories that were being deliberately left out. And when I was told that they weren't gonna, that they didn't matter, and that in 10th grade being shown Birth of the Nation as if it is fact, and having to walk out of the classroom makes me know that young people are ready and able to hear what they need to hear. I think if you have an open classroom and allow the different voices, the different questions to come out, is a useful way to address what are real issues. And I don't know if that is, I know the constraints that you all have in this whole idea, but critical race theory is a thing. And it's something that is a legitimate theoretical perspective, just as important as structural theory in sociology, as any other of the theories that we use to help explain our society. I don't know if there's a database that lists the mural social justice. That's a very good question, Colleen, because that would be something instrumental. I know that they collected from the protest last year. They have collected the murals that were painted on the boards, and the arts I would say the Arts Council, North Carolina Arts Council, may be I know they've collected some of them, and they may have that information. But if not, that's an excellent idea. That's an excellent project for someone to engage in, because these bureaus are wonderful teaching tools in my mind, just all over, just the different kinds of bureaus we have across the country. I mean, across the state. Do y'all have other questions or comments? You know how to get in touch with me if something comes up. I think that this is something that's ongoing, and there are always questions. I can say to y'all that just like you're in this particular workshop, to also look into, if you don't already know, the National Endowment for the Humanities has wonderful summer programs for K-12 educators. And I did one for when I was at Bennett College as a college professor in 2017, and it was an amazing experience. I just got so much information, but I also made contacts and connections, and that's why we do these kinds of institutes as well.
Does anyone have any other questions for Dr. Johnson?
Oh, I see that someone's going to Hoover Dam. Yes, I know Hoover Dam. So congratulations, Chauncey, and enjoy that. Enjoy whatever you're doing. And I'm still living off of those resources. I was in Seattle at University of Washington, so it was great.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for spending part of your morning with us and for an extremely enlightening and motivating conversation this morning. We really appreciate you being here, and I'm sure we've all learned a lot and have a lot to move forward with. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. And you all do well. Enjoy the rest of your day, and continue that learning. And what you all are doing encourages me to know that there's some great stuff happening in our K-12 system. So I salute you all.
Thank you. So before we move into our next session, I noticed that our second graduate assistant for our grant has joined us. So I wanted to take a minute to introduce Madeline Moore. Madeline, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, I can do that real quick. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everybody. My name is Madeline. I'm the second graduate assistant for the grant project. I've just been gathering some research and working on the grants literature review. This is my kitten, Ivy. She wanted to be a part of the party. I'm currently working towards my MLIS at UNCG and my school library licensure. I'm hoping to be working in an elementary or middle school library soon, but I'm just excited to be here today with everybody. And I hope that everybody is enjoying their workshop this morning.
And we definitely have a lot to thank Madeline for in her assistance in setting up this workshop and with this entire grant project. We would also like to thank Natalie Strange and Jonathan Permar for partnering with us and facilitating this day of training for everyone in the group here with Guilford County. We wouldn't have a workshop without educators to talk to and present to and work with. So we thank you both very much for wanting to partner with us and for being enthusiastic advocates for what we're trying to do here in this workshop. Okay, so I'm the next session. So I'm gonna move right in to our session on information literacy and how to help students in finding and evaluating credible information. We started this grant project a few years ago based on some college information literacy observations that Kathleen had in the course of teaching one-shot and continuing sessions to college freshmen and other levels of students. And we had partnered on some primary source workshops and started having some conversations, because I spent 10 years teaching college and university level information literacy as well in Raleigh and Washington, DC, and saw a lot of the same things. So the goal for this session is to really help you feel a little bit better equipped to understand information literacy and source evaluation, so you can help guide your students to making better information choices. So the first question that I want to pose to you is, how do your students look for information? Where do they go? What do they find? Feel free to unmute and speak up, or to put something in chat. They find information on Instagram. That is quite a scholarly source, but it's the reality of things. TikTok, Google. Yes, the first page of Google search results, they rarely get beyond that. These are all excellent examples of where our students are at right now. So throughout this session, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, to put them in chat. I'll try to address things as we go, or there will be hopefully time at the end if you have questions as well. So let's jump into the startling reality of how students are looking for information and how prepared they are. The reality is really depressing, quite frankly. Less than a third of first years are prepared for college research. I've seen it, Kathleen has seen it, you've seen it in your schools. Students have lots of access to information and technology, but that doesn't mean that they're savvy at sifting through that information, finding the reliable resources, understanding what the difference is in the different things that they're seeing, or even remotely being able to assess whether what they're seeing is valid, is reliable, who it's coming from even. Studies have shown that most middle school students can't discern the difference between sponsored content on websites and genuine news stories, partly because they don't know the terminology. They don't understand what the term sponsored content means. And they equate search rankings with reliability. As we said just a minute ago, students rarely get past that first page in Google search results. They think that that first page is the best stuff there is on whatever they're searching for. Whether that's because they think that Google has their best research interests at heart or not, they equate those search rankings with reliability. So the Stanford study looked at research and middle school, high school, and college students. They did an 18-month survey on how students at these levels evaluated information. The Stanford University Graduate School of Education assessed their skill or their knowledge in evaluating those sources, and they looked at 7,800 students across 12 states. They asked them to evaluate the information from tweets, from social media comments, and from articles, and found that overall, young people's ability to reason about the information on the internet can ultimately be summed up by the word bleak. It's not inspiring where students are at or where they're willing to go with their research. They want easy, they want convenient, they make assumptions about the resources that they're using, and their honesty, their reliability, their agenda, essentially. One piece of this, a direct exercise from the Stanford study, looked at a photo from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. On March 11th, 2011, we know that there was a nuclear disaster at this power plant. The photo that you can see on your screen was posted on Imager, which is a photo sharing website, in July 2015. What are your thoughts on this photo? Do you feel like this photo provides strong evidence about the conditions near the Fukushima Daiichi power plant? Why do you think that? Explain your reasoning in whether you think this photo provides evidence or not, and what you think it says about those conditions. And feel free to unmute or just put it in chat. Hannah?
Yeah, I think that at least, coming from the research perspective, knowing how to do research, I think it's a really close-up picture that doesn't give you much idea about what the actual surrounding is. And then we also know that Photoshop is a thing. So I think that I'm a little skeptical.
Okay, great. In chat, Colleen says, no, there's no verification of when and where it was taken. Yes. Molly says that there's no watermark for the photo to identify the photographer or the photography company. Yeah, you guys are thinking critically about this photograph and about the provenance of it and the bigger picture of it. But in reality, less than 20% of students in this study questioned the source of this post or the source of the photo. Nearly 40% of students argued that the post provided strong evidence because it presented pictorial evidence about conditions near the power plant. And a quarter of the students argued that the post didn't provide strong evidence, which at first glance might be heartening, but they only said that because it showed flowers and not other plants or animals that might have been affected. And yeah, as Colt said, we know that plant mutations or variations can happen anywhere for any reason. And if students dug a little bit deeper into this, they would find that, that this is actually caused by a common plant mutation called fasciation, not nuclear radiation at all. So how do we help students think more critically about information? First, we want to try and understand how they think about information in the first place. So in terms of evaluating information, I'll pose another question to you. How do your students think about information? Do they think about it, or do they just believe everything they see or find? Anyone? Hannah?
Yeah, I think a lot of my students have trouble, for lack of a better term, caring about like the real world implication of it all. They're focused really focused in on just getting the assignment done, rather than thinking about why we're teaching them these skills, so that they don't aren't led astray by everything they see online. So I think for me, a lot of students are just concerned about getting the assignment done and not thinking beyond that.
And that makes sense. I mean, I think beyond students, most adults don't have time for the deeper dive, or have bigger priorities that they think are more important than ensuring the reliability of information that they pass on. We see that every day on social media. As Molly mentions, they take everything as truth often and don't consider bias, even if the resource that they're finding information in is reliable. There still may be bias present, and they don't stop to think about that. A lot of times, Heidi makes a great point, author is questionable at best. Who is putting this information out? Sometimes you've got an author listed, sometimes you don't. Things are moving into the listicle range. And so there's not always fleshed out information in a lot of places where students and adults are looking. And yeah, Colleen mentions that students for the most part believe it and trust social media influencers. You've got a lot of big names, or big lists of followers or likes. If something has a lot of likes, or a poster has a lot of followers, then they must be reliable. They must have the in on valid information. So I think it's concerning for students, but it's perpetuated in adults. It's not limited to just where students are at. So if we can try and lead them to better sources now and help understand where they're coming from and what those barriers are and how to make it easier for them to think critically about information, it might be that little nudge that they need going into adulthood to question things that they're seeing. So let's talk then about evaluation criteria. I'm going to talk about the 5 W's, or the 4 W's and an H. There's a lot of great source evaluation resources out there, things like the CRAP test, the Accord model, ABCs&P, lots of different, everybody's got a different acronym for the source evaluation criteria that they use. But essentially, they all look at a similar set of criteria, no matter what they call them. They look at who, when, where, why, how. So no matter what you're familiar with, you're used to using, what students have used before, or what they might use when they move into college level courses, breaking things down to terminology that they know and use can help overcome those barriers. We've got terminology that college level librarians use can be agenda, credentials, oversight, relevance, currency, authority, bias. But what do those things mean to students? Who, when, where, why, how are terms that students are familiar with. And so let's take a look and see where those lines are drawn between the criteria that we want them to look at, currency, relevance, bias, purpose, things like that, and the simpler terms that they're more familiar with. We'll start with who, which essentially breaks down to authority. It looks at the source of the information. Who's the author or the publisher? Who sponsored the information? What are their credentials or their organizational affiliations? Are they qualified? Do they have the necessary expertise to write about this? Students can look at the contact information on a website or on a byline. Look at the URL of the site that they're at. Does it tell you anything about where this information is coming from or who's sponsoring it? When it takes a look at currency, it looks at the timeliness of the information. When was the information published or posted? Has the information been revised or updated? Has the information changed about this topic? Does the topic require current information, or will older resources work as well? That depends on the topic or the discipline. STEM topics tend to require timely, current, updated information because those topics change quickly and frequently. History, literature, art history, those disciplines can often use older resources as well as newer resources. So understanding the discipline can also help in students understanding how current the information they're looking at needs to be. Where takes a look at accuracy. It looks at the reliability of the content that they're looking at, where it comes from, where it's published, is it supported by evidence, and asking if you can verify any of the information in another source. Students should look for evidence or supporting information. They should look for whether the resource cites references or and check those references if it does. If there's linked information, follow those links, go down that rabbit hole, even just a few clicks, and that will help you understand where the information is coming from and whether it's valid. Students tend to look at one resource and think that that resource is the be all end all of the information that they're looking for. But if they can't find that in other articles or other websites or books, then that information should be called into question. So we've got the question, when should this information be introduced? At what grade level? I don't think it's too early to have students think about the basics. Who said that? Where did you find that information? The questions that they're asking about information don't need to be deep. They don't need to be extremely in-depth or complex. They can be as basic as when did that information come out? Can you find that somewhere else? Who is that author? I think when you get into things like bias, that maybe is a little bit more advanced, more complex in thought for younger students, but there are ways that this can be introduced at any level. So I would definitely encourage folks to talk to school librarians to get ideas on how to teach this, or at what level certain questions are appropriate, or when to introduce things. Colleen mentioned that school librarians are required to teach digital citizenship. So they start information literacy beginning with kindergarten. She says that she introduced it with 5th graders. So your school librarian will have a lot of great perspective on how to talk about these things with your students, what exercises you can use, how to break down the questions or the topics. Hannah asks if I have advice on making evaluating sources a positive experience. Yeah, a lot of the times we frame it as someone trying to mislead them, but exactly, you want them to be critical and to think about what they're looking at, but you don't want them to be afraid of information or look at information as with suspicion. Absolutely, Colt says that it could be framed as helping establish a student's credibility to make them seem more trustworthy. I think also I do some work with group work, with a list of questions and a source, and they talk about it together to think about who's writing it, what their biases might be, what supporting evidence might be able to be found about the topic or the perspective. And that's something that can be done with an article from the internet, with a scholarly article, with a primary source. I have a handout that I have given out to groups to work on together, to think and bounce ideas off each other about the source. And if you have students broken out into groups with a range of primary sources or a range of other types of sources about a topic, some that are valid and reliable, some that might be a little more suspect. Once you bring students back into the group to talk about their resource and the reliability of it according to the criteria that they look at, they can see how other students were thinking about their resources, how their own group worked through those questions. And it helps them to establish the different perspectives on information and how other people view information, think about information, and question information. You can also do scavenger hunts. Tammy mentioned some great gamification of information literacy. Definitely. giving students the tools that they need to think critically about the information that they're looking at, and breaking it down into ways that are familiar to them, words that are familiar to them, questions that are easy for them to understand and ask about the resources, are really helpful, as Heidi says, in empowering them and building their confidence. Because if they don't understand what you're talking about or what words you're using in the first place, they're automatically going to throw this out the window. Because the questions, they need to be able to understand the questions that they need to ask about resources in order to feel comfortable with asking those questions, in order to be comfortable with thinking critically about the information that they're looking at. So we'll pick back up with our remaining W and H. Y takes a look at the purpose. It looks at the reason that the information exists. Why was it published? For whom was it published? Is it objective? What was the intention behind the information? Was it to inform, to teach, to sell, to entertain, or to persuade to a particular perspective? Is the information fact, opinion, or propaganda? And have students look at the language. Is it inflammatory, persuasive? Is it neutral and just presenting facts? Just like when you see information about cybersecurity and trying to be aware of phishing attempts and the language that we'll call them fishermen, the language that fishermen use to try and get us to click that link or to provide that information. They use language that's designed to instill fear or a sense of urgency, or to really get you to feel strongly in a certain way. It's a similar way to look at the purpose of information that you find. It's usually pretty clear whether the author is trying to inflame you about something, or incite a response, or call you to action, or just entertain you, or really just present facts and a solid evidence-based opinion or information on something. And then our last one of the 5 W's is how, which looks at bias. So it looks at how the information is presented. Sometimes you can tell if there's clear bias, sometimes you can't, but you should look for any political, cultural, religious, institutional, or personal opinions or prejudices from the author, the sponsoring organization, or the text. Take note of where the information is coming from, not just the author, and not just the organization, but is there a parent company? Is there a sponsoring company or an affiliated company? You want to go back again to the about us or the information about the organization, because just the name, students have looked at the name of the organization and it sounds very authoritative or scholarly or important or professional. And people can name their organizations whatever they want. It doesn't necessarily reflect the intentions of the organization accurately. So students can dig into that to find a little bit more about bias that might be present in the information. So let's take a minute to do a quick annotation exercise. You should be able to click the View Options button in your Zoom toolbar and go to Annotate. You have a couple of options. You've got the stamp tool and you've got the text icon. So I want to pose the question to you, do you use evaluation criteria currently, like the CRAP test or ABC&P or the Accord model or something else that might have a name, might be the 5 W's, might not have a name and just be your own thing? Use the stamp tool to put a check mark next to the criteria that you use, or if it's something else, go ahead and use the text icon to type in what it is. And then in the activities side, let's give a brief explanation if you currently do any kind of source evaluation activity with students. I'll give you a few minutes to think about this.
And just to remind a few people, Jen, I'm thinking are probably still looking for it. Again, if you go for either the top or bottom of your screen, click on View Options, you'll see a few things pop down, and one of those things is Annotate. And then you'll get that nice little toolbar that Jen was talking about.
Thanks, Tammy. Okay, so we've got some folks who use the CRAP test. I used the CRAP test for years. And I feel like for a lot of students, they buy into it because of the name. The name hooks them. I always got a little laugh when we first started talking about the CRAP test. Other students or some other teachers, they didn't like it because of the name. So I've had other groups who preferred to use something like the Accord model because it sounded more authoritative, I guess, or more reliable. So in terms of activity, okay, we've got someone who already uses the 5 W's. That's great. We've got an evaluation activity that uses readings of short articles and group activities to determine if they're real, fake, misleading, or satire. That's great. For those of you who are putting check marks in the something else category for the criteria, does anyone want to talk about what it is you're currently using? Okay, so if you want to type something in chat to share about what you're using, that's great. We can always come back together and talk about that toward the end. Great. Okay, so some folks are telling students to track things back, to find the receipts. Does everything add up? we've got some scenarios where students look at labels and bias in articles. That can be really helpful. Christopher, can you give a little more information about what HIP analysis is? Okay, so this is based on history. That's right. Great. So H looks at the historical situation of the document. I is the intended audience. That's terrific. P is the purpose, and the other P is perspective. Great. So whatever discipline you're looking at or you're doing source evaluation in, you're looking at a lot of the same criteria. So this is great. Thanks a lot for all of this.
Can I interject and share how I teach it? I
Absolutely.
teach world history, and I always start out looking, talking about a fight. If there was a fight in the cafeteria and you were not there, who would you want to hear about the fight from? Somebody else who heard about the fight, somebody that was actually there, somebody who had a friend that was in the fight, and that sort of thing. And we talk about how stories changed based on who is telling it and who would be the most reliable source and what kind of source would they want to see to take place if they were not there to view it themselves. And they usually figure it out from there as to which source they would want to use.
That's great. That really can help look not only at the reliability of the source, it can address the bias of the source. There's a lot of, I think, criteria there that can be unpacked. So that's a really interesting exercise.
So we look at that through those lens, and it's something that everybody can identify with, whether they admit to it or not. And then we move on from there, looking at websites, and we evaluate that way. Not saying that I still don't get some Wikipedias, but I don't get very many.
Sure, that's great. That's great. That's a really good idea. Thanks for sharing.
No problem.
Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to talk really briefly about resources and how we get students out from under Google or social media for academic or reliable resources and research. So just a few resources to share with you guys really briefly. We'll start with the State Library's Finding Reliable Information Sources Research Guide. This guide takes a look at analyzing fake news versus reliable information, how to evaluate news articles and some good sources to go to for reliable news, looking at data and statistics, how to evaluate the numbers or the data to make sure it's accurate, or things to look for to try and understand whether the data is slightly off or misinterpreted or misleading. And then some more about how to evaluate sources. And of course, you've got a chat box to chat with a librarian at the State Library. Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. If students have questions, they can just type directly in the chat box and get help with their resources. We've also got NC Wise Owl, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. They've got sections for middle school and high school both that gives curated resources, including a number of research databases and other e-resources that the state library provides as well, that Kelly Agan will talk about later on this afternoon. And then we've got NC Live, which provides not just a great number of databases and research articles, but also video and ebooks and other excellent resources for students to go right to. All of these are linked in my slides, which are in the Padlet. So you'll be able to get all of these links and take a deeper dive later on this afternoon or on another day. But we are about out of time. So I want to thank you guys so much for your participation and sharing your stories and your experiences with your students' research and evaluation, and ask if anybody has any questions at this point. Awesome. Thank you, Colleen, for sharing that link to what you've created for your students. Let's definitely take a look at that later on today. Thanks very much. Okay, so we are going to move now into a quick 10-minute break before we start our next session. So I believe Tammy is going to put up our timer on screen, and you can grab a drink, grab a bathroom break, stretch your legs, whatever you need. We'll see you guys back in 10 minutes. Thanks a lot. welcome back from the break, everyone. We are going to move into our next session. Dr. Leonard Rogoff has taught at UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina Central University, and Duke University. He's the former president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society and recipient of its Lifetime Achievement Award, and he's lectured and published widely. He now serves as historian and president of Jewish Heritage North Carolina. His books include Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina, and Gertrude Weil, A Jewish Progressive in the New South, which was the winner of the 2017 North Carolina Historical and Literary Association's Award for Nonfiction. Please welcome Dr. Leonard Rogoff to present on Gertrude Weil, her life and involvement in the suffrage movement in North Carolina.
Thank you. The first question I was asked to address is, why did I choose Gertrude Weil as a subject? I discovered her while I was doing research on the history of the Jews in North Carolina for a multimedia project, Down Home. Gertrude's name stood out as president of the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina, founding president of its League of Women Voters, and an activist for social justice and African-American civil rights. An interesting woman, I thought. And then as I began to do interviews with old timers, whenever I would mention Gertrude Weil's name, they would sit up and a big smile would break across their faces. Everyone recalled her blue eyes that sparkled with fun and mischief. One historian described her as straight back, straightforward, but never straight-laced. She laughed easily and often, frequently at herself. She was modest, kind, and generous. And throughout her 91 years, she remained perpetually youthful. I told my wife at the time that I was in love with another woman, but not to worry since she was dead for 40 years. Distinguished women's historian Anne Fiore Scott described Gertrude as, quote, the most prominent leader among North Carolina's organized women, and wrote that a biography needed to be written of her. When I discovered that she had left 104 boxes of papers, 42 cubic feet at state archives above our librarians here on Jones Street, it seemed a book was waiting. I didn't imagine it would take 4 years to research and write it. And the lesson is, before embarking on work or a career, make sure it's something you love. A final reason to consider Ms. Gertrude is how much the issues of her day resonate today. We may think today's conflicts are uniquely problematic and unsolvable, but we can see much of today in her times. If we think that politics are crazy today, what about in 1897 when the legislature referred a bill allowing women to vote to the Committee on Insane Asylums? Letting women to vote was thought to be insanity. Look back at the insanity of Gertrude Weil's world. Women were denied the vote or legal rights to their own property and children. African Americans were segregated and deprived of civil liberties. Lynch mobs took justice into their own hands, often with the collusion of local sheriffs. A gun-toting mob in Wilmington violently overthrew an elected city government. Elections were truly corrupt as political bosses stuffed ballot boxes. Public schools met 4 months a year as the public did not see the need to pay taxes for education. In 1900, the state had but 2 high schools for African Americans. Immigrants were attacked as aliens and laws prevented Asian immigration. Police and guardsmen fired on unarmed workers who were on strike, shooting some in the back. Children and women were exploited in the fields and textile mills. Tenant farmers, even without slavery, were trapped into poverty. This state divided bitterly between conservatives and progressives, with fears expressed that the country was turning socialist or communist. When Gertrude Weil was born in Goldsboro in 1879, 2 years after Reconstruction, ex-slaves walked the streets, and when she died in 1971, civil rights protesters marched. At her death, she had lived through nearly half this country's history. Her family were Bavarian Jews who had immigrated in the 1840s and 50s, part of a wave of some 150,000 Jews pushed by poverty and anti-Semitism from German lands, and pulled by economic opportunity and religious liberty to America. Her extended family, Wheels, Rosenthals, and Ettingers, were links of a family chain migration to Eastern North Carolina. As was typical, they first peddled before opening stores in the budding mill and market towns of Kinston, Wilson, and Goldsboro. Jews were an early example of an immigration we see today as Asians, Africans, Arabs, and Hispanics arrive. There's the same pattern of family chain migration as one family member pulls another. Jews created an economic niche opening dry goods stores, just as today we see Southeast Asians owning motels, Palestinians opening convenience stores, or Mexicans creating restaurant chains. Gertrude was raised in a multicultural German, Jewish, American household. On the dining room table were barbecue and goose cracklings. As a child, she studied German and Hebrew. Multiculturalism is not new to North Carolina. While her Christian colleagues were motivated by the Protestant social gospel, Gertrude was inspired by the prophetic liberal ethics of Reform Judaism. Gertrude's family led efforts in the 1880s to build a synagogue in Goldsboro. Her parents enlisted their daughter as a Sunday school teacher and principal, which she did for more than half a century. She attended Sabbath services her entire life. Never married, Gertrude remained within the bosom of family, a favorite aunt to nieces and nephews and caretaker of her widowed mother. Family wealth gave her the independence to dedicate her life to public service. The histories of activist women typically begin in church, or in this case, synagogue benevolent societies. We heard that true also with African-American women. The largest suffrage organization was the Evangelical Women's Christian Temperance Union. While wheelmen invested in banks and mills and served as town aldermen and university trustees, the women volunteered for charity societies. Her mother, Mina, was endlessly generous to the poor, both Black and white. She created a child care program in a mill village, enlisting Gertrude as a teacher. When asked to what inspired her commitment to social justice, Gertrude would explain, "From my earliest childhood, I have seen poor people at my mother's door." After Goldsboro Public Schools, Gertrude finished high school at the Horace Mann School at Columbia College in New York and became the first North Carolinian to graduate from Smith College. At a time when less than 3% of women attended college, she received the finest education available to women. Smith, like many colleges, was transitioning from a classical curriculum in Greek and Roman culture to a modern curriculum based on economics, sociology, and political science. She read Adam Smith and Karl Marx. She learned about class conflict, colonialism, and women's inequality. Gertrude was both a Southern lady and what was then called a new woman. She was a religious woman who held traditional views of faith, family, and community, and a college-educated, reform-minded progressive who would apply scientific principles to social problems. She was raised with both lost cause nostalgia and New South enterprise. Gertrude embodied contradictions and that we still feel in North Carolina today, a society that is traditional and modern, conservative and progressive, rural and urban. She was a practical idealist. As a Southern lady, she worked for progress, not through revolution, but through the electoral process. She wanted both social order and social justice. Although a lifelong resident of Goldsboro, Gertrude Wheel was a cosmopolitan. She lived successfully in a rural small town because she could afford to escape it. She traveled so often that friends joked about finding her at home. She was in Baltimore and New York often to see family, but also to attend theater, concerts, and museums. She toured Europe, visiting German relatives in Paris, London, and Frankfurt. She was a citizen of both Goldsboro and of the world, seeing her native South from both inside and outside. Today, as new immigrants settled here and multinational corporations open offices and factories, We speak of a global South. Gertrude, too, lived locally, but thought globally. Gertrude faced the challenge of educated women of her day in confronting limited career choice opportunities. A popular book for educated women was titled, quote, "After College, What?" Responding to her mother's call, she returned to North Carolina, where she joined her mother in the newly formed Women's Club movement. Mentored by the grand Southern lady, Sally Southall Cotton, known as the mother of women's clubs, Gertrude rose quickly in the State Federation of Women's Club hierarchy, learning skills she would apply to the suffrage campaign, using newspapers for free publicity, editing newsletters and yearbooks, organizing grassroots chapters, and serving as a liaison to the national organization. Elections for club offices educated women on the ballot. As Federation Gertie she pushed clubs to move beyond social gatherings, sewing circles, or literary societies. The term municipal housekeeping describes how women brought their domestic responsibilities as mothers and housekeepers into the civic marketplace to improve schools, promote sanitation, and beautify cities. Like many women, Gertrude was motivated by the deplorable condition of working children and women in the textile mills and cotton fields. In 1880, 75% of the textile workers were women and children. In 1916, at the Women's Club Convention, Gertrude spoke on the Cry of the Children, where she called for a survey of children and women's labor. Young college-educated women like Gertrude, trained in scientific methods, recognized that their mothers' church-based voluntary societies were inadequate to solve the systemic, social, and economic problems of a new South that was rapidly industrializing and urbanizing. What was needed was not charity, but social and economic reform, political action. Though these women were socially progressive, they largely overlooked African-American women who worked in tobacco, cotton fields, or domestic service rather than in the textile mills. Sally Southall Cotton advocated for public education, sanitation, and prison reform, but she was also a white supremacist. In 1909, African-American women in the state formed their own North Carolina Association of Colored Women's Clubs. One founder was Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who we heard about in our first lecture today, who also helped found the National Council of Negro Women. It advocated for uplift programs and sponsored a home for delinquent girls in Eflin. Gertrude often said that, quote, social welfare, that's the chief interest that I have ever had. For a progressive woman, the vote was not an ends, but a means to achieve social reform. In a conservative traditional Southern society with hierarchies of race and gender, women's suffrage was not universally popular, not even among women. And there were polls that confirmed that. Of the 10 states that rejected suffrage by 1920, 9 were Southern. Women's suffrage was one battle in a larger cultural war fought between traditionalists and progressives over issues like birth control or teaching evolution. These cultural wars continue today on issues like abortion, voting rights, or as we just heard, critical race theory. After 1910, younger college-educated women like Gertrude were entering the suffrage movement. And with national societies endorsing it, the campaign revived. Suffragists confronted a choice between the mainstream, moderate National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, and the militant National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, a radical veteran of the British suffragette movement. Catt's tactics focused on public meetings, speaker tours, letter writing, and political lobbying. Paul organized parades in Washington streets, which ended with rioting spectators assaulting the marchers. The 1913 suffrage parade in Washington inspired women to organize across the nation, including North Carolina. That year, poet Barbara Henderson of Chapel Hill founded the Equal Suffrage, next slide please, founded the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina and affiliated with Catt's National Association. Gertrude organized and led a chapter in Goldsboro. And you can see Gertrude far left. In 1914, Mina Wheel opened a letter addressed to Gertrude. Out tumbled newspaper clippings about the National Association. It was from President Catt, who had devised a, quote, winning plan to achieve suffrage. In each state, Catt appointed a field commander to lead a campaign to ratify a federal constitutional amendment. In North Carolina, she chose Gertrude Wheel as that commander. Neither could have known how consequential North Carolina would become. By 1920, 35 of the 36 states needed to ratify the suffrage amendment had endorsed it, and only 2 states remained if it were to become law, Tennessee or North Carolina. During World War I, the Radical National Women's Party intensified its militant campaign. Silent Sentinel suffragists chained themselves to the White House fence and set fires, burning President Woodrow Wilson in effigy. Arrested, imprisoned, and brutalized by the police, the suffragists went on hunger strike. Gertrude, ever the Southern lady, speaking on behalf of the National Association, denounced such, quote, undignified demonstrations. As a journalist noted, Southern women were, quote, trying to get suffrage in the most ladylike manner. The argument then, like today, was when does protest become rioting? The National Association women argued that it would be counterproductive to oppose the government while our boys were dying overseas in a world war. Suffragists argued that their patriotic service, working for the Red Cross and teaching school entitled them to the vote. The National Association and National Women's Party played complementary roles, and suffrage would be achieved both by lobbying and protesting, by persuasion and confrontation. In January 1919, Gertrude was elected president of the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina. 5 months later, the US Congress passed the 19th Amendment, sending it to the states for ratification. Anti-suffragists in North Carolina responded by organizing an affiliate of the Southern Rejection League. You can see their offices were right next to each other on Fayetteville Street in Raleigh. Mary Hilliard Hinton, an aristocratic plantation lady, led the opposition. Textile manufacturers opposed the women's vote, fearing that regulated child and women workers would end cheap labor. Liquor interests feared prohibition. I don't know if you can read it there, but this is some anti-suffrage propaganda arguing the more a politician allows himself to be henpecked, the more henpecking we will have in politics. A vote for federal suffrage is a vote for organized female nagging forever. This is what Gertrude was confronted with. Christian conservatives cited scripture that women's role was as a wife and mother in the home, that having women vote, children would be abandoned, families broken up. Others saw a communist plot. The most powerful reason of all, a state senator told Gertrude, was that it would bring on race problems. Southerners feared that the women's vote would open suffrage to African Americans who had been disfranchised in 1900. Resisting any challenge to white supremacy, white Southerners insisted on Southern rights, on states' rights, not wanting the federal government to dictate who is entitled to vote. Yet suffragists also knew that they needed Southern legislatures, if these very same white supremacists, if the federal amendment were to be ratified. The national suffragists deferred to white Southern racial feelings, despite an active African American suffrage movement. Following Catt and the National Association, Gertrude cited what was called the statistical argument, observing that women's suffrage would only strengthen white supremacy, given that white women outnumbered Black men and women. In so doing, however, Gertrude affirmed that Black women would indeed vote, a radical proposition at that time. Nor in her speeches and writings did Gertrude engage in race baiting or disparage African Americans, as was common on both sides. And this conflict between the women's suffrage movement and the Black civil rights goes way back to the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment. if you look at the conflict between Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. On a hot August day in 1920, Gertrude entered a sweltering state capitol in Raleigh as the legislature debated ratification, while Carrie Chapman Catt lobbied in Nashville, Tennessee. Telegrams flew between the two women. The North Carolina legislature tabled the vote. The next day, newsboys on Fayetteville Street shouted, "Tennessee's ratified." North Carolina women won the vote without their state ratifying. A month later, Gertrude convened a meeting at the Guilford County courthouse in Greensboro. And by the way, in October, they're going to install a plaque there, where she announced the State League of Women Voters. She continued as League of Women Voter president. At that first League of Women Voter meeting, Gertrude raised the question, how and why shall women vote? You'll notice this flyer here, the address for the North Carolina League of Women Voters is Gertrude Wheel's home address, 200 Chestnut Street in Goldsboro. This struggle to define a purpose plagued the League for the next decade. The League's nonpartisan voter education programs challenged the democratic political machine that governed the state. The League's agenda was to focus on a social problem, engage in education, followed by political action that would lead to legislation. The democratic machine, ruled by boss Furnifold Simmons, architect of white supremacy, was notoriously corrupt. The 1920 election for governor was widely regarded as stolen. The League wanted electoral reform and clean government. Arguments over election fraud are thus nothing new. When Gertrude attempted to vote in 1922 at her Goldsboro precinct, a poll watcher handed her a ballot already marked for the Democratic machine. After tearing it to shreds, Gertrude saw more marked ballots stacked on a table. She ripped into those. The Goldsboro newspaper reported, quote, "The corrupt political healers were dumbfounded, and the fellow who was marking ballots challenged her to send a man to do her fighting." Soon she was front page stuff throughout the nation. This got national headlines. Following the national model, the North Carolina League conducted citizenship schools in partnership with state colleges. One such school in Boone drew women from 38 counties, 800 came to Chapel Hill. Working with UNC professors, the League published booklets on citizenship, parent-teacher relations, school nutrition, playgrounds, and rural education. UNC economist E.C. Branson wrote Gertrude, this is one of my favorite quotes, quote, "Our civic structures were built by men. They must be renovated and perhaps disinfected by women." And here's the clincher. "Men are not cruel by nature. They are just stupid." Gertrude, with League of Women Voter Executive Director Mary Cowper, traveled the state seating chapters. Some 120,000 North Carolina women registered for the 1920 election, and both political parties welcomed them. Lily Exum Clement of Asheville was elected to the State House from Buncombe County, the first woman in the General Assembly. Despite its 27 local leagues representing 23 counties, the State League struggled to create a political culture among women. Funding was so short that Gertrude and Treasurer Laura Cohn, a member of the wealthy Greensboro textile family, reached into their pockets to keep it afloat. And we can talk later, but Laura Cohn is, especially for those of you in Guilford County, would be somebody well worth studying. Despite a Get Out the Vote campaign, the numbers of women voting declined in 1924. The progressive era had come to an end. Professor Woodrow Wilson, with his idealism, yielded to businessmen Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. After the patriotic sacrifices of the Great War came the Roaring '20s. The nation was about making money. Flappers, not League lobbyists, became symbols of a jazz age. The League had had limited success. It lobbied for such causes as women's guardianship rights to their children, to sit on juries, to raise the age of consent, or to testify in rape cases. Incremental progress was made on child labor and women's working hours. Women often felt frustrated and disrespected. The League's first national success, its signature issue, was the Maternity and Infancy Protection Act. the federal government's first effort at state funding and social welfare. And North Carolina created a Bureau of Maternity and Infancy. Women began moving tentatively into positions of power, all of whom had been friends and suffrage colleagues of Gertrude, many of whom also were women's college graduates. Kate Bird Johnson in 1921 became the first woman in the country to serve as State Commissioner of Public Welfare. She was replaced by Annie Boss, who turned the agency into a major welfare organization. Gertrude's Goldsboro friend Annie O'Berry had once picketed an overalls factory where her husband was president. During the Depression, she directed the state's Federal Emergency Relief Administration, where she fought to distribute funds by merit rather than by political patronage. Breaking the power of the corrupt county courthouse rings, many of these women were mentored by Harriet Elliott, a dean and history professor at Women's College, who became an influential force under Franklin Roosevelt in national Democratic politics as leader of the Institute for Democratic Women. The League's greatest struggle, which would prove its undoing in North Carolina, was its advocacy of labor reform, of labor rights. Whoops, we're moving up here. I'm sorry. Could we go one slide above? Yes, that's right. We want to go back to the labor. The next slide, please. No, I'm sorry. I guess they're gotten out of order. Then we need the next slide. That one, all right. The League's greatest struggle, which would prove its its advocacy of labor rights. The resistance of the manufacturers, governor, and legislature to unions was unyielding in a state whose government was described as a business plutocracy. Again, look at these striking workers. They're just children. The League advocated an 8-hour day and 44-hour week for working women, while state labor laws authorized an 11-hour day and 60-hour week. Gertrude fought for a survey of working women. The governors, typically mill owners or investors, saw the survey as a wedge to open the door for labor unions. Governor Angus McLean testified, quote, that league belittled them as, quote, that league of women voters, and politicians promised to, quote, make it hot for the persons involved. The League was cursed as radical, and the Southern Textile Bulletin warned about Jewish communists. The General Assembly either tabled, rejected, or failed to introduce bills reducing women's hours in industry and begrudged only slight reforms on children's labor and education. The League's focus was white working class women, overlooking exploited African-American women who worked as domestics or tobacco workers. Yet Black women registered to vote in large numbers. Gertrude admitted that she was not fully informed on what was being done, quote, for better understanding between the races. Gertrude always confessed that she'd been raised with prejudices. In her home, African Americans cleaned, cooked, gardened, and chauffeured. At a national conference on interracial relations in 1925, she reported that race relations in her state were, quote, happy and harmonious. Southern white liberals commonly expressed goodwill towards, I think if we go back up to, to the one previous, if we could go to the Great Migration, one more, that one, toward African Americans oblivious to feelings of Blacks who are voting with their feet in a great migration out of the South. Southern white liberals, Gertrude included, expressed paternalism or maternalism on race before committing to racial equality. Class as well as race divided women, and even Black-white dialogues were between middle-class women. Middle-class women attending League meetings and working-class women leading factory walkouts did not cross class lines or bond as a feminist sisterhood. To Gertrude's disappointment, women's vote was not consistently progressive, but followed that of men. As her friend and colleague, UNC President Frank Graham observed, Gertrude Weil was sometimes caught in the crossfire of the conflict. Two close colleagues, fiery Mary Cowper, the League of Women Voters executive director, and moderate Cornelia German, director of the League's Legislative Council, conflicted on labor reform. From the left, Alice Paul's National Women's Party campaigned to pass an Equal Rights Amendment. Gertrude criticized the Equal Rights Amendment as the so-called Equal Rights Amendment. The League of Women Voters opposed the ERA, fearing it would eliminate protection for working women. From the right, the old anti-suffrage coalition furiously attacked the League, alleging that the maternity and infancy bill had been drafted in Moscow and that such policies that the League advocated as disarmament was a communist plot. All right, if we can move forward to labor violence. I think we're a little out of order here. Go down one more. Okay. The labor strife that Gertrude and the League had sought to prevent exploded in 1929. In Gastonia and Marion, strikes erupted into violence that left a sheriff and many striking workers dead, some shot in the back. Among the dead was Ella Mae Wiggins, a labor balladeer and union organizer. The graveside photo of Wiggins' small children became an icon. I found a copy of this photo actually in the Gertrude Wheel papers. The governor called up the National Guard, which did more to protect Millware interests than safeguard the workers. The public sympathized with the industrialists rather than with the workers. Some unions were in fact communist-led. North Carolinians believed in the gospel of industry, which promised economic salvation to a poor rural state. Many women withdrew from the League because their husbands' livelihoods depended on the textile industry. The South has remained historically unfriendly to unions. Like many state leagues, the North Carolina League of Women Voters faded away, only to be revived generations later. Women now gravitated toward the political party. The state Democratic Party gave women equal representation. Gertrude's suffrage colleague Gladys Tillett of Charlotte, another women's college graduate, rose in Democratic politics, serving as a delegate to the 1932 Democratic National Convention that nominated Franklin Roosevelt. She took a national leadership role as director of the Speaker's Bureau of the party's women's division. If the women's alleged failure was relative to their high ambitions, but incremental progress had indeed been made. Hours were reduced for working women, child labor all but ended, school hours and educational standards rose. A centralized bureaucratic state government ended courthouse rings. Women now had voices in economics and foreign affairs. The corrupt democratic machine was voted out. Progressive Governor O. Max Gardner secured the secret ballot, encouraged the African-American vote, and enacted the South's most liberal workmen compensations laws. With the election of Franklin Roosevelt and New Deal labor codes, exploited workers found relief with an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour week. The welfare state came into being. Gertrude was exhausted. Like many women, she had responsibility for an invalid aging mother, and in 1932, she was diagnosed with cancer. The Depression had struck North Carolina hard. Farm income fell 2/3 and the state ranked 45th among the states in per capita income. Beggars wandered Goldsboro streets, knocking on doors. When the state created an emergency relief agency with federal support, Gertrude chaired the City Emergency Relief Committee, allocating funds to put people at work, building privies, restoring cemeteries, creating parks, staffing clinics, schools, and libraries in both Black and white communities. Gertrude knew well, personally, the problems of the poor as president and a caseworker with the Goldsboro Bureau of Social Services, finding foster homes for orphan children and placing tuberculosis victims in sanitariums. Nationally, relief rolls were overwhelmed, which was widely blamed on, quote, feeble-mindedness. To address this alleged what they called the moron problem, she supported birth control, serving as an officer of the Maternal Health League. Southerners were reluctant to endorse birth control, which was popularly regarded as a radical proposition by feminists and communists, a violation of scripture. By the 1940s, birth control won support as a public health measure, and the maternal health leagues adopted a new name, Planned Parenthood. Gertrude's birth control activism led her to an unfortunate advocacy of eugenics. North Carolina's sterilization program persisted until 1977, longer than any other state. Eugenics in its day was supported by political progressives like social reformer Jane Addams and liberal Supreme Court Justices Holmes and Brandeis. The original targets were white tenant farmers and mill workers, so-called hicks and hillbillies, but as the civil rights movement arose, the campaign focused disproportionately on African Americans. But by then, Gertrude had abandoned eugenics. In none of her eugenics advocacy did she speak of race. Her bias was one of class, not of race. Increasingly, Gertrude realized that racial inequality lay at the heart of the South's social and economic problems. By 1930, she joined the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching and directed her philanthropies to African-American causes, building personal relationships with Black teachers and school principals, social workers, and healthcare practitioners. Among them, and we've already heard about her, was Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the pioneering Black educator who had founded the Palmer Memorial Institute, an elite African-American boarding school outside Greensboro. At social service conferences, Gertrude heard Brown speak passionately of the personal humiliation she suffered from segregation. In 1932, the governor appointed Gertrude to the Commission on Interracial Cooperation. She became a familiar figure at African-American schools, clinics, and community centers, where she was respected and honored both for her philanthropy and for just showing up. She grew beyond white paternalism to appreciate that Blacks were agents of their own destiny. World War II changed Gertrude's focus. Gertrude, like other suffrage women, notably her friend Gladys Tillett, had acted as citizens of the world as well as of their hometowns. They attended international conferences and lobbied Congress in support of causes like peace and disarmament, the League of Nations, a World Court, and later the United Nations. As Jews of German origins, the Wheel family felt Nazi persecutions personally. Their German relatives were desperate. Some she knew from her European travels, others were strangers. From Europe came letters pleading with Gertrude and her mother to obtain American visas or money for passage to America. The State Department created obstacles to prevent Jewish migration from Nazi Europe. North Carolina Senator Bob Reynolds called upon the federal government to build a wall to keep them out. He did not even want to allow in children. I think that sounds familiar. Gertrude worked tirelessly to obtain documents, lobbying the government and sending thousands of dollars to underwrite their escape. She sponsored some dozen relatives to America. Later, she would dedicate herself to create the State of Israel. Here she is in Charlotte with Eleanor Roosevelt, who is signing a Zionist proclamation. We have the next, there we are. She visited Israel twice and back home spoke out to raise funds and political support for the Jewish state. The Holocaust demonstrated the murderous consequences of racial hatred. After the war, as African Americans demanded equality, Gertrude's cause became racial justice. North Carolina's concern was not racial justice, but economic development. Its leaders wanted to avoid violence that would deter out-of-state investors. Neither massively resisting nor closing its schools, North Carolina earned a reputation for moderation. Of Southern states, it was the most compliant with federal mandates, but also the most segregated. Gertrude, now an outspoken integrationist, saw through the hypocrisy of North Carolina's, quote, middle way. When Goldsboro created a biracial council, she opened her home as a leader of the Women's Goodwill Committee for Interracial Parlor Meetings. A Black participant recalled that it was, quote, whites and Blacks actually going into each other's homes to drink coffee, eat donuts, and talk that broke segregation in the city. Gertrude attacked segregation with her usual wit. Invited to, quote, bring her friends to a Democratic political rally at a segregated hotel, She led a parade of African Americans into the lobby. "We had a lovely time," she commented. When an African American complained about grinning black jockey hitching posts in front of Goldsboro home, Gertrude painted her as white. Upset that the town lacked a swimming pool in the Black community, the Wheels donated land and funds to build it. When dedicated in 1963, Gertrude showed up wearing a robe, stripped to a swimsuit, and at age 83 dove headfirst into the pool, inviting the excited children to follow her. As white flight overtook her downtown neighborhood, she remained in her home, socializing with African American neighbors. She joined integrated groups like the Southern Conference for Human Welfare at a time when race mixing was conflated with communism. In her 80s, Gertrude busied herself with friends, family, and community. She had been heartbroken when Frank Graham lost his US Senate campaign in 1950 in a bitterly racist campaign. But the gubernatorial campaigns of progressives like Carr Scott and Terry Sanford, who rejected racial politics, won her support. On her deathbed in 1971, she was still full of humor, joking that there was nothing wrong with me except old age, and I'm afraid that's terminal. As she lay dying, the North Carolina General Assembly ratified the 19th Amendment. She had given away her considerable wealth to charity and bequeathed her historic home to the city as the site of a public library. She would die in the house, if not in the very room in which she was born. I thank you, and I would certainly welcome any questions, and I do have some suggestions for maybe activities that you could conduct with your students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogoff. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, why no hats? It's from the photo of the NC Federation of Women's Club.
You know, I was wondering about that, and Sally Sathall Cotton wrote a history of the North Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs, and makes a big deal about the no hat, and I was quite mystified by that myself. I think what it might represent was that the women's clubs had this tension between those who held on to it as a kind of a elite social women's organization. You know, they used to begin their meeting with singing Dixie, and there was a younger generation of women led by Gertrude. And you can see from this cover picture of her, she's not, at one point in her youth, she certainly wore very elaborate hats that was not concerned at fashion at all. And they were trying to push the organization into becoming politically active in causes for social welfare and social progress. So I think that might be the comment about no hats. Yes.
So these are comments, but I think it kind of falls in line with what you were just talking about. Maybe what are some suggestions on using like these materials in the classroom?
Well, okay, yeah. Here are the last slide we just missed here. If we can go all the way back to the slide that we just had pictured here, I have there. I should have done what our previous speaker did, is to come up with a bibliography of books that you might want to look at. One book, one really good source is Margaret Supple Smith's and Emily Herring Wilson's North Carolina Women, which is a comprehensive history of North Carolina women, starting with the pre-colonial days, the status of women in Native American culture, all the way up to the current age. You can see Gertrude's on the cover there in that suffrage picture. Also that North Carolina women. There are biographies of some women, notably Nell Battle Lewis, the journalist, Susie Marshall Sharp. There's some writings on Black women. There's a new anthology coming out by the of women in various states, which consists of capsule biographies, a volume there, North Carolina Women. What I would suggest, a couple of things. One activity that I think our librarians would like this is look at the significant dates in history, and especially women's history, which would be, let's say, the August, from the middle of August to the end of August of 1920, and go and scan your local newspapers. You can find these from online sources and see, what were the letters of the editor? What was the editorial policy? How is this being reported? And you can go back and check out significant dates in the evolution of women's rights to see what the local comment was. One of my favorite resources, and often overlooked, are local history rooms. Many families within some of these communities, I mean, I've gone in with elders from some communities, not realizing that their local history room had folders and files documenting their family's history with newspaper clippings going back a century that had been maintained there. And so that's really an excellent source for finding material. And also, there are any number of these women, especially a lot of you have women's college backgrounds, and we really, North Carolina, the historians have really overlooked women's contributions, and there are other women who certainly need biographies: Kate Bird Johnson, Gladys Tillett, Cornelia German, Annie Lando Berry, Annie Kaiser Bost. These are all women who are significant in North Carolina's history. And one of the other points I would make is not to segregate this history as, well, yes, I guess it is important to write North Carolina history of North Carolina women, but to integrate it into the larger narrative of North Carolina history. In the 1930s, when the first iteration of the League of Women Voters faded away, Adelaide Daniels delivered a speech entitled, "More was expected of us," and they confessed their failure. But again, as I tried to stress at the beginning, if you look at the situation, what our country consisted of in the 1920s and what came in the 1930s, you can see that there was a total transformation in our society. The government had not taken responsibility for social welfare. Federal aid to the states had not been firmly established as a funding principle. And corrupt governments were overthrown, especially in this state. So again, there was a transformative effect.
So some of the comments they were talking about is like how wonderful it is that you can like look at images and let me read them to you. Sorry. Said photos are very powerful motivators to understand better the working conditions, especially for the textile furniture making industry in our area. And then someone also said, absolutely, especially when we point out to students that these kids in the photos are their age, if not younger.
Right. No, it is startling. The term child labor is an abstraction until you see the faces of the little children actually trapped in the mills. And it's an act of imagination to ask them that instead of sitting in a school as a 10 or 11-year-old, that you would be working in a textile mill and bringing money home to your parents to feed your family. And that's especially true in Guilford County, which is, a textile industry. Laura Cohn would be an interesting person to study because her husband was part of the Cohn family, was a textile executive. And she actually stepped back from the League out of deference to her husband once the League took up the cause of labor rights. And this was a dilemma that many, many women faced because the textile industry was so dominant in the state. I liked Annie O'Berry, who picketed a plant where her husband was president. I wonder what went on at their dinner table. Anyone?
Well, if I could comment, so looking at these photos of what it was like to work as a child or a woman in these mills, you can easily connect that to today's materialism in where are we buying our clothes, where are they made in, are we being wasteful? I mean, this is something that we should be thinking about, and the next generation should be thinking about. What are the working conditions of those people that are making our cheap clothing?
Yeah, that's something to understand, the exploitation of labor. Yeah, I mean, and there's a larger question now that we're asking about class conflict. You know, people speak of a prosperous economy, but is it is our prosperity spread evenly? Do workers have certain rights? Someone I saw asked a question about where the League stood on the 1929 Gastonia strikes. And the League had to, again, walk a tightrope. It called for an impartial investigation. And again, this is something that has, I think, resonance in what's going on now in terms of our issues, our relationship with the police authorities. You know, the workers, yes, there were militant workers and a sheriff was shot, but in almost all these cases, especially in the Marion strike of 1929, in which workers were shot in the back, the people who were prosecuted were the workers. The police were acquitted of actually what were murders, and of course no one charged the mill interests. And the League of Women Voters lobbied for an impartial investigation, which even Governor Gardner at the time, who was in relative terms a progressive, would not implement. The biggest fight they fought was for a survey, because nobody really knew the condition of women and children in the mills, because the labor unions were, not the labor unions, the mill interests were resistant to having any survey or any independent governmental authority come into their mills to investigate. And that was really the conflict. And I know today we hear allegations, you know, critical race theory, for example, is communist. We find communists under every rock, but in fact, in the 20s and 30s, some of these labor unions were communist-led, did have active communists. And when a fellow by the name of Fred Beal in the Gastonia strike was going to be arrested as a labor organizer, Fred Beal fled to the Soviet Union. Yeah, I think the League of Women Voters was also accused of being communist and Bolshevik. So they probably very much wanted to keep their distance from an active labor advocacy, what they would always argue for. And again, because they're their own constituency, having so many women members whose husbands worked in the textile industry, and being sensitive to this, being branded radicals, that they always insisted on impartiality rather than advocacy of one position or the other. Any other questions? I also had, what are some of the other suggestions I came up with here? You know, one of the things you might want to do, again, I talked about, and that's, I mean, I found it fascinating reading, to go back and to look at the newspapers to see how your local newspaper covered the strikes at that time, and what the letters to the editor were saying. it's also interesting, I really didn't talk about it much, to trace the difference between the political parties. The Republicans were actually pro-suffrage at the time. They didn't have such a great presence in North Carolina, but to see how things have turned around. Sometimes I see letters where people are saying, oh, I mean, the Democrats, at one point, the Republicans were the progressive party. They were the party in support of Black rights, and more so than the Democratic Party. And of course, that has somehow rebalanced.
And so we have one last question before we end your session. Is your impression that Gertrude Weil became more aware of and sympathetic to what African Americans experienced because of what the Nazis did during the Holocaust? Or
I think it started a little earlier with her, but I did see she was a member of the North Carolina Commission for Interracial Cooperation, and I did see a pamphlet in her papers by the president-elect dated 1945, and what it just, of course, the term Holocaust wasn't used at that time, or as it is now. But the president-elect of the CIC said, the Nazis have shown us the fruits of racial hatred. It is now time for us to make friends with the Negro. So I think that was a general attitude, that racial thinking, racial prejudice was widely discredited popularly by the Holocaust. I think Gertrude's transformation began earlier, I think starting in the 1930s and the early 1940s. I did interview a woman who lived with Gertrude Weil in her home. She was a public health worker who later became the head of the World Health Organization's education program in Lausanne, Switzerland. But she said when she came there that Gertrude took her into the Black community to do public health work, and that she had a lot of relationships there within the community already, and it was very well received there. So I think it probably predated the Holocaust, but it certainly intensified it.
Thank you, Dr. Rogoff. That was an unbelievably rich and deep story about Gertrude Weil. And I know a bit about her history, but I had no idea that it was really so complex. And I really appreciated the way you grounded it in the Southern context, how she was situated between the nostalgia of the Lost Cause myth and then the progressive ideals of the New South and the country. And I think that that was just really, really helpful. And it makes me now move your book up to the top of my reading list. So
thank you. Yeah, it is interesting. She had two uncles who were in the Confederate Army, one of whom was killed, but was pointed out that the only organization she never joined was the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Wow. Yeah, that's to her credit. And I think that it's wonderful that it reminds us, along with Dr. Valerie Johnson's talk this morning. I mean, I think these were really two wonderfully complementary pieces for us, that these political and social movements are not monolithic. Not all social change is good, and there are so many complexities and contradictions and really exclusions in each of these narratives. And there's just so much territory, I think, to mine for teachers and students, and that that in the transition to the present day, and really what we've seen in our own time, that that reminds us that these movements for the common good and social justice really, as they were in the past, these are unfinished this is unfinished work of the nation. So, and I think that, I really appreciate how strongly that resonated with me. And I think that the intersectionality that you both talked about and the contradictions and the diverse aspects of these narratives will really segue well into our next session, which is going to be me. And I'm going to talk to you a bit briefly about working with primary sources, specifically in the classroom. And then we're going to let you have a chance in this session for most of it to really get together and get your hands on some artifacts and talk to each other. That's the main goal of this session. So let me, without further ado, share my screen. Sure, I'm sharing my screen. I believe I'm sharing my screen. All right, can you see my PowerPoint? Great, thanks, Jen. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about for about 15 minutes here is to get a grounding in using primary sources in the classroom. And for many of you, it may be a refresher. For others, it may be really something entirely new. And hopefully what I have to say to set us up for our activity will really speak to both of those. And when I was really sorting through things to think about this session, it reminded me back to learning about Benjamin Blue's taxonomy when I was in teacher training school myself in the 14th century. And I don't think it had ever occurred to me really until I was thinking about this sort of for this talk, that, how valuable primary sources really are for thinking about, combining all three categories of learning behavior, from the cognitive to the affective and the psychomotor. And this morning, we've had at least a great foundation with two of those, which is the affective piece. We've heard from Dr. Valerie Johnson and Dr. Rogoff that really hopefully, sparked our curiosity and our historical imaginations and really gave us personal connections to these historical moments and these individuals. And so in this activity, we're going to sort of try to combine that psychomotor learning by doing piece to all of that. And I think that using primary sources in the classroom really affords us the opportunity to synthesize all of those aspects of learning, which make them really so powerful. They provide an opportunity for analysis and critical thinking, as Jen talked about in her talk. Exploring mysteries, problem solving, creating synthesis and creation activities from them, trying to connect the dots and tell stories, and to hopefully help learners make those personal connections to history and people and events that really does result in deeper learning. And personally, I love the thought that we can bring primary sources into the classroom from all domains of learning, whether it's science or math or literature or history. For example, a medieval counting rope tool could be brought into a contemporary math or physics classroom to talk about how people use them, how architects use them in the Middle Ages to design buildings, a simple rope with knots in it. That biology students might read the nature journals of a 19th century female botanist, to spark their understanding about how another person in another time and place viewed the natural world around them. Maybe even someday, if Marie Curie's journals are no longer radioactive, students would be able to understand, her experience in life and work. And and on a more contemporary note, that maybe someday high school students would also be allowed to, read Toni Morrison's works, Beloved or the Bluest Eye, and be able to read her letters along with them eventually someday when those are, made available online. That the richness of those experiences, I think, it can't be overstated. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about some background about incorporating primary sources into the classroom. so that we can sort of just get our heads in our activity. So a few discussion points, and feel free to, use your thumbs up reaction tool, or write in the chat, your reactions to this, just so that everybody can sort of take a minute to get a baseline on where they are, in using primary sources, their experience with their students. So the first question to think about is, when talking about research with your students, have you found that they really understand the difference between a primary and a secondary source? And feel free to use the thumbs up if you're a yay to that. Okay, no thumbs up. So, I think that's telling. And as Jen talked about, the data in her presentation about, deficiencies in students' information literacy. When you talk to students about using primary sources, do you feel in general as if they have skills to use them on, to find resources online? Oh, and I see in the chat, nope, no, they don't. Yes. Right. Well, hopefully, yeah, right. Noted this as well. And, and I really hope that today will impart to you, some tools and resources that will really help to mitigate this gap. Next question, once your students have found a source, do you feel that they have the ability to evaluate its content? Do they understand author's perspective? Are they able to imagine how it is connected to a specific moment in time or historical period? Conversations, Terry, right, okay. Yeah, right, okay. Yeah, and feel free, just not on their own, I see. Okay, thanks, Terry. Okay, and Christopher says, not at first, it takes time working them with scaffolding. Yeah, I can really appreciate that, because even as adults, even as professionals, it's not easy to work with them, even folks who are seasoned researchers, it's very difficult. And finally, do you think that students are able to make the transition from finding sources, once they are able to find them, to actually being able to use them and write about them? And I guess that's a higher skill. No, at least it says no. Yeah. So hopefully, again, we'll be able to share with you, some strategies that will hopefully help you, approach your students with this type of learning. Okay, so a few definitions, one definition actually. So what is a primary source? And I think that is a complex question that can be context dependent. But the American Library Association provides a definition that's very similar to the Society for American Archivists and other sort of information institutions, and that generally we like to say that they are the evidence of history. They're usually original records created by participants or observers at the time historical events occurred, or it could be well after an event in a recalling, for example, memoirs and oral histories. And here are a few types of primary sources that we think are commonly considered to be primary sources: diaries, letters, photographs, ledgers in business history and economic history, recordings, film, clothing and other artifacts, oral histories, art, and then various items that are included in manuscript collections. Now, and that's by no means a complete list. And can you think of any that you might use or that you consider primary sources that are missing from this list? And feel free again to write some of that in the chat. Songs, oh great, right. Hannah, thank you. Right, social media, exactly. Speeches, yep. Right. Oh, architecture. Yeah, exactly. Buildings, right. And murals. Dr. Johnson shared those beautiful murals with us this morning, and those can be considered primary sources as well. Yeah, so the range is expanding. Oh, thanks, Terry. Love it. You know, and I read actually, I thought this was a really good example of how sources can be both mixed. Sometimes they can play both roles as a primary or secondary source. And sometimes something that we might consider a secondary source, like, for example, newspapers, really can be treated as primary sources. And, you know, and for example, Lincoln's death reported in the Baltimore papers. We might consider that, you know, that's a secondary source because it's reporting on events that occurred, but not from firsthand accounts. And yet we can use that source as a primary source if our question is about how did the people in Baltimore, if we were looking at how did they hear about the assassination? Then we're looking to things like newspapers that might be a secondary source to use them as a primary source. So it's not, these are not set in stone. Okay, I have always the obligatory problem with my mouse in every presentation. Sorry about that. So why should we use primary sources? And, you know, and I think that, you know, Dr. Johnson and Leonard Brogoff have both, you know, given us more than hints today about some of the values of using these items in practice in the classroom. And I think that that there are at least 4 main reasons that they can really be beneficial. And I think the first reason is that primary sources allow and really engage students or learners of all ages in having their own interpretation of a research topic. It's their own idea, and that they come to it with, they create the story in their mind about the meaning of this artifact. Primary sources also provide evidence to support a research topic and an argument. They act as puzzle pieces that can be connected to form a larger story. And I think one of the most important reasons is that they allow a way for learners to relate to the past through understanding the experience of others. And Jen hit on this in her talk this morning, so I'll go through this very quickly because this is just a foundation for the event that we're going, or the activity that we're going to do together in about 2 seconds. So we want to, when students are looking at primary sources, there are some very simple models for how to get students to engage in a dialogue with them. And really it's looking at those questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Was the source created? We want to know how the creator came to get this knowledge about an event. Was it secondhand to them, or were they first person involved? And every piece of evidence and every source really has to be viewed with, I think, both skeptically and critically, but also with an open mind, so that, you know, students can be aware of the details that are in it and, you know, examine it in its totality. Was the creator neutral, or did they have opinions that influenced how they recorded it? And, you know, I think that's important because all sources are biased, as Jen pointed out this morning. Bias is inherent in everything. We can't escape it. And it's important for students to learn to understand and sort of suss out that bias. You know, and just a sort of quick points on how to help students establish research plans when they are looking at primary sources. And I think it's really important to have students choose topics that they can actually find sources on, because a lot of times it's difficult to find a source and it's not going to be any fun and or inspirational if they're struggling to do that. Help them frame an argument to support their position. Share our professional tricks of the trade to help them with their thesis questions and resources. And then model online research strategies for finding high quality primary sources from trusted repositories and trusted institutions. And we'll hit on that this afternoon. And the next piece is to help them critically assess sources. And that's the activity that we're going to do. So lo and behold, our hands-on activity is suffrage. Since we've heard so much about social justice and suffrage this morning, it provides just an ideal way to, now that we have these ideas and thoughts and facts in our heads. So we're going to break you. This is actually going to be hopefully engaging and interactive for you. And Tammy is going to divide everyone into, we're going to be in 4 groups. She's going to randomly assign you to a breakout room. So in a couple minutes, everyone will kind of poof out of our main screen here into their group. And when you get in your group, make sure you have one person who's going to record what you discover, and then one person who's going to report out. And when we send you to the breakout rooms, we'll also share the Padlet with you. There's a Padlet for this activity, and each team has their own column in the Padlet. And when you determine what you're going to talk about and share out with the group, we'd like you to click the plus sign and just type your ideas and type your brainstorming work in there to share out. And that resource will go to everybody. Oh, thanks, Tammy. So we want you to do a couple things. First, we want you to go through this exercise of interrogating and exploring the artifacts that your team has been assigned. Determine who is the creator or the author of the item. Assess the author creator's connection to the events associated with the item. Decide what is the author or creator's understanding of the events, what is their bias, and then how can this document be used to add to the historical analysis of events associated with suffrage in North Carolina or in the nation, but hopefully some ideas about using this for North Carolina history as well. And then after you've done that activity, we'd like you to brainstorm a takeaway. So how could you take what you just did in this activity and use it as the seed for an activity that you will use in the classroom? And does anybody have any questions before we send you to the pad or into the breakout rooms? No?
I have a question, actually. Can we
Okay.
use outside research, or should we just focus on what we have available to us in the Padlet?
That's a great question. So this afternoon, we're going to have another longer activity for you folks where you can explore resources outside of, for example, the resources in this activity. So probably for this one, we'd really like you to look at at least the artifacts that we've given you. If you find other materials that kind of help you understand them, that's great, but definitely to use the artifacts to build your discussion. Thanks.
Can I add something really quick?
Absolutely.
Under the instructions category, you'll see exactly what Kelly has talked about, and you will have one member from each of our team to facilitate each one of the groups. So they'll kind of answer any questions and guide the discussion. Also, Kelly's session and her resources are right down here at the bottom underneath the instruction Padlet. So if everyone will kind of go to that link, again, I'll put that in the chat box so that everyone will be there, so that when we do put you in groups, you'll be there, okay?
Oh, thanks, Tammy. I appreciate that. That's why we have you here. And we're going to take 20 minutes in the breakout room. And then at the end of 20 minutes, Tammy will close the breakouts, and then we'll come back and we'll reserve 5 minutes for each team and their designated sharer to share out, what you found and what you've discussed. Great. See you in the breakouts.
You may get a message that says go to your room at the top, so please click join. I'm not sure. Wiley, are you able to, I'm sorry, I get your username is Wiley B. Do you see your join opportunity? You should be in group 1. Wiley, are you having any issues connecting with group 1? I'll be glad to help you get there. Wiley, do you need any help getting to your group? Colleen?
Tammy, my internet went out. Can you put me back in group one? I'm so sorry.
Yes, no
It just-
problem. I'll put you in group one.
Sorry, it just all went away.
What happens?
Tammy.
I think we have everyone back at this point. Kelly, do you want to lead the discussion?
I would be delighted to. Sorry, I was having my connection was bubbling for a second. Thank you. Actually, I really enjoyed that thoroughly in my group. We thought we would just go through each group, and we have just about 18 minutes, so that's a little over 4 minutes per group. So I will hand it over to our designated person for group 1.
That would be me. First of all, I would like to say I enjoyed my group immensely. Gave me a lot to think about and chew on. I hope you guys enjoyed your group as well. We had the photos of the women in the cars. And I can't see our Padlet notes. Okay. But am I supposed to be able to see the Padlet notes or no?
Yeah, I think she needs to see the Padlet notes.
I mean, I could speak off what we were talking about, answering the question.
Thanks, Tammy.
We had a deep discussion on whether the pictures were staged, and if a picture was staged, what kind of impact would that make on the person's looking at the actual photo? Okay, I still can't see it, but
You're looking for the comments, or you should be able to see the Padlet at this point. Are you not able to see it?
No. So somebody from my group want to take over that can see, because I can't see it.
You click on your inner, you could possibly click on the Zoom button in your tray at the bottom of your screen. That may help you see the Padlet.
Okay. I hate taking up time. Oh, here it is. I saw it. All right. In the first photograph, we see Madam C.J. Walker, specifically a woman of color. In the second, we notice the car is full with cities listed on the car. The car is surrounded mainly by white men. And we talked about how, white men had the equipment to take the pictures. And then we looked at the final photograph where you only see Fannie Wilson. The women are driving. And we talked about how during this period, to see a woman driving was a phenomenon. And we talked about what driving actually symbolizes. And then we see that you see Madam C.J. Walker, which has a little different connotation because, of course, she was a woman of color, and she was showing how women of color, or in this particular time, had money, and she got it on her own accord. So I think we kind of continue talking about empowerment and the freedom of women, and how the political scene was staged way before 1920 when the amendment was actually passed. We looked at the freedom of general mobility, looking at women's socially, economic, and political as far as women's suffrage. That was it. That was our group. And I hope I did a good job answering those particular questions. Thanks, Team 1.
Yeah, there was some great discussion about also the role of technology, and the photos looking staged, and yet they could only have been staged in the time period because there was no such thing as the snapshot, basically, that it was a production to take a photo. So the second group, let me take a look here. The second group had a political cartoon and some posters about suffrage, and I will turn it over to group 2.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had 3 posters, and interestingly enough, 2 of them were pro-suffragettes, and then the final one was anti-suffragettes. And so that's who we identified as the creators, the first 2 being the pro-suffragist organizations or movements. We can see in the second one that there is a little a few identification markers for who the movement might be, but it's too small to be legible. But nevertheless, we get just from the message alone that it is for the advancement of women's rights. However, the third one, which we thought was pretty funny, is against the suffragette movement. And so that's who we identified as the creator for that. You can see that it is a man doing all of the housework. There's a child on the floor. It's sort of chaotic. In the background, it reads, everybody wants a mother, but mine's a suffragette. And then the husband is saying, I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. So we have two opposite messages going out here. And what we really paid attention to was that they both are relying on pathos, that appeal to emotion. The first two being the rights that a woman feels that she deserves at this point, especially after all of her contributions to the war. While the second one is coming from the male perspective and is really speaking to men, saying this is what's going to happen if you let your wife go out and vote. So we did talk a lot about using these pathos-driven cartoons in the classroom, not only to teach the emotion appeals, but also to connect them to women's issues going on today, such as autonomy and other women's and humans' rights. It's sort of our takeaway from it.
Great, thank you. So group 3 had some artifacts that included a textile and a fan and a flyer for household hints. So I'll turn that over to group 3.
Is
So I
anyone,
really,
Group 3?
is anyone wanting to discuss? There are notes there, group 3.
Terry, do you mind taking it over?
Sure. So we talked about these 3 artifacts, and like if we were like bringing them into our classrooms. I spoke specifically from my English classroom, and we pointed out, or we discussed the sash, the votes for women sash, and we just talked about how sashes can be associated with pageantry or pageants, or patches of honor, whether it's something in Scouts or different things like that. Because students may not, I mean, you show them a sash, they may not know, like, what is this? Or what would it be used for? So that would make it, that would give a connection when introducing that. We also discussed the fan. I want to speak for myself at the polls. Ms. Chauncey pointed out, and thank you, in our school, culturally, our students that attend church, it's very common to see a fan, and so there's different information on the different fans. It could be something about local information, it could be something national, it could be something historical. And so we compared that and the perspectives that you can get, whether it's freedom of speech. I think I'm talking about the mask now. We compared it to wearing a mask today. That's your freedom of speech. And you can find different messages on different people's masks. It's like they're saying it without actually talking about it. And the household hints, these pamphlets, a way to, I guess, get that personal connection or help students to understand what a pamphlet is, because they probably don't see those.
pamphlets are similar to flyers, and we discussed how flyers can be seen definitely on a college campus, maybe in the university center or student center, and we discussed in bathrooms. You can see them in the community. You can see them on street lights or street poles, and also sometimes even on your car windshields. So that's one way to, I guess, make those items, I guess, get that perspective and connection for students in your classroom. I hope I did that justice.
Actually, you absolutely did. I really love that because I liked the way that the historical artifact was carried forward to the present day, and what's similar, what's different. So that was a great perspective.
Thank you, Group 3.
So yes, thank you, Group 3. So the last group is Group 4, and Group 4 had 2 artifacts that are appear to be opposing flyers on suffrage.
And the
Opposing
notes for
viewpoints.
hours are in the column to the right under the additional resources column.
Got it.
Keep scrolling. There we go. Do we have a reporter? You're on mute, Hardy.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
We've all done it.
The 12 Reasons Why Women Should Vote is the first document, and that's by an organization, the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina. And those are pretty straightforward. They have statements that are supporting why women should have the right, and they try to be pretty straightforward with most of these. You can see the certain words are in all caps: women, children, home, and then at the bottom it is for the common good of all. So they're trying to emphasize those connections. I think one of the things we thought was most interesting was number 9 says, because public-spirited mothers make public-spirited sons. And it's suggesting that women who are engaged will make a positive difference for their sons, but it does not mention the daughters. And it seems to suggest trying to appeal to men, recognizing that women are more engaged in raising children. So the sons, who will later become the men, of course, would benefit from their mothers being more engaged. And so the tone was very straightforward. They did seem to be kind of trying to reason, to try to argue with, against the other side, and taking the high road and taking suffrage as a serious topic. And then when you go to the next document, that one presents a very darkly humorous anti-suffrage message. The organization is the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. We were curious to know if that organization was made up of men and women, or maybe even just women. But if you look at the hints that they're provided, a lot of them are literal home remedies for dealing with situations in the home, but mixed up in those are some arguments against the ballot. The first statement is, you do not need a ballot to clean out your sink spout. So it's suggesting stay focused on what's really important, and you know, there are also suggestions that that men can take care of this so that you can focus on what's really important. And it's a part of that same flyer, I think, that group 3 had, and it even goes on to a third page that that shows tries to give some other arguments, you know, why you should vote against women's suffrage. And as far as using in the classroom, I think these would, you know, both of these documents would be fascinating to present side by side and look at how the two groups approach things so differently in terms of their tones. The one against voting is much darker and has some, if you could go back to the second one, I'll point out one more last thing, or the second page of the second document, the to the left, I think the button to the, yes, and it says, if an anti swallows bichloride, give her whites of eggs, but if it's a suff, give her a vote. Suggesting that, you know, maybe if voting is so important to her, give her that, but that won't really help her in this situation. So anyway, that they were very interesting documents to look at.
Great, thank you, Hardy. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this session and just really in a very short period of time, taking a hard look and kind of digging deep into these artifacts. And I do want to apologize for running over with the introduction and then kind of fast forwarding a little, but we've ended mostly on time, so that's wonderful. And we're going to take a break now for a half hour for lunch to give you a chance to rest and digest in more than one way. And when we come back at 12:30, we're going to take a few minutes to just sort of talk through your impressions and your ideas from the morning sessions, and then we'll launch right into the afternoon. And if you have any questions, bring them and we'll address them in the afternoon. So thanks very much and enjoy your break.